Chapter 193. Fang Xijian left Cursed City with a silver fox, a demoness howl, and 300 magic power beans. He had already tried the magic power beans. 3 magic power beans a day was more or less enough to replenish the depletion from his cultivation. It would be enough for him to use them until the regional selection. Therefore, he wore an ordinary short-sleeved shirt and walked on with his feet firmly on the ground. In just over half an hour, he arrived in the deep mountains and forests. Far away from the crowds, the smoke of war, and all sorts of worldly affairs, Fang Xijian pursued absolute tranquility in order to comprehend that hint of inspiration in his heart. At the start, Fang Xijian was not used to the fact that there was no one to cook, no one to wash his clothes, no clean rooms, and no bright lights. However, he could only walk alone in the forest, feeling the humidity in the air, the muddy ground, and the dirty and messy forest. Every step he took, his physical body was cultivating his sword arts, and his mind was trying to grasp that hint of inspiration from heaven's perception. When he was hungry, he would eat the magic power beans. When he was thirsty, he would look for a stream to drink. When he was tired, he would sit down and rest. Sometimes he would look at the sky, sometimes he would look at the rivers and streams in the valley, and sometimes he would look at the mountains in the distance. Gradually, from the discomfort and dirty and messy feeling he had when he first came to the forest, he started to feel a sense of tranquility and freshness. A beard started to grow on his face, and his untrimmed hair was covered in dirt and split ends. His clothes became more and more tattered, and he looked more and more dirty. However, his spirit became purer and purer. The various messy things that he had encountered in the city were gradually brushed away like dust from his heart. He felt that he was becoming more and more tranquil, as if the surrounding nature was gradually merging together. He listened to the sound of the wind. He could feel that there were insects crawling on the ground several meters below his feet. He could hear birds building their nests on the trees over 10 meters above his head. He could feel the flowers and grass swaying in the wind from tens of meters away. He could sense that there was a small stream emitting abundant water vapor several hundred meters away. The world in front of him seemed to have become clearer, and there seemed to be many more voices beside his ears, telling him the secrets of this world. However, they were always vague, and he could only truly understand them when he was just a little bit away from truly understanding them. Therefore, he continued to head north. His shoes had become tattered, and he simply walked barefoot. His feet were like metal pillars. Trees were broken, grass and stones were crushed, and nothing could leave a mark on them. Unknowingly, he had arrived at a large river. Looking at the river that flowed endlessly like the Yangtze River, Fang Xijian did not stop at all and directly walked up. His legs streaked across the surface of the river at high speed. He looked like he was walking, but in fact, his speed was extremely fast. Because he was fast enough, the tension of the river lifted him up, allowing him to walk on the wave. Following the rows of waves, he crossed the river and walked to the other side of the river. On the ferry by the shore, countless people exclaimed. The old man who was rowing the boat knelt down and shouted, "It's the water god! The water god is here! Water god bless us! Has the water god shown himself?" A bunch of fools, a merchant who was more knowledgeable mumbled, "It should be a knight? But that level 19 knight I saw previously could only swim across. To think that this person can walk on the waves?" However, Fang Xijian could not be bothered with a bunch of fools who worshipped him as a god. He walked past the riverbank and continued to head north. Regardless of whether it was the forests, mountains, rivers, or swamps, nothing could stop him from advancing. On the mountain path, a group of soldiers from the City Guards Institution were advancing rapidly. The knight in the lead wore a grim expression as he shouted, "Hurry, hurry, hurry! Those bandits are right in front. We must catch up to them." All the soldiers from the City Guards Institution bellowed and wanted to increase their speed. However, just then, maniacal laughter suddenly rang out from the surrounding mountains. "Idiots, you've fallen into an ambush!" "What?" the knight shouted in shock and fury. A sky full of arrows rained down from the sky, shooting toward the soldiers from above. The knight activated his reduced force field and naturally ignored the rain of arrows. However, it was not the same for the ordinary soldiers. In that instant, more than half of them died or were injured. The knight let out an enraged bellow and charged forward, but was pushed back by the bandit leader's palm. This bandit leader was also at the first transition. That knight bellowed, "Flame Wolf, are you crazy? I'm going to wipe out your entire Seven Flames Hall. Haha, you dogs of the Empire, wait till you get out of here alive before saying that. No one will know that you've been killed by us." Just then, a black shadow flashed past, like a black line tearing through the sky, darting over the two groups of people. Then, sonic booms rang out, and a series of loud sounds flashed across the sky as if thunder had struck. Then, under the knight's horrified gaze, over 100 bandits were like fireworks that had been lit up, exploding into clouds of blood mist one after another. Even the bandit leader, who was at the first transition, was no exception, being smashed into over 100 pieces of rotten flesh. Passing through the mountain path in the valley, Fang Xinjian did not stop. His mind was filled with countless sounds, and by the time he regained his senses, he had already arrived at the top of a great snowy mountain. It had already been a month since he had left Cursed City. Standing at the peak of the snowy mountain, looking at the majestic snowy peak piercing into the sky, looking at the endless snowy mountain under his feet, with its beautiful branches and jade leaves, a sense of astonishment that he had never experienced before entered Fang Xinjian's heart. The snowy mountain was vast, but it was quiet. In this silence, Fang Xinjian could finally hear the sounds in the air clearly. That was not a real voice. It was the information contained in the ether particles. Temperature, humidity, sunlight, length, height, color. As more and more information from ether particles gushed into Fang Xinjian's brain, the information within 10 meters around him gradually assembled in his brain. In the next second, he could already see the scene within 10 meters of his surroundings in his mind. At this moment, Fang Xinjian had gone through countless hardships and paid an innumerable price. He had finally taken the crucial step and reached the realm of heaven's perception. Countless information that could drive an ordinary person crazy gushed into Fang Xinjian's brain, but was directly accepted by his unrivaled talent and strong will. At the same time, a sixth attribute appeared on his stats window, other than strength, agility, endurance, reaction, and flexibility. Ether synchronization rate. 10%. This ether synchronization rate represented how much information he could receive from ether particles. 10% was the threshold for attaining heaven's perception, which meant that 10% of the information was sufficient to form a basic sensory image in his mind. This was similar to the clarity of a photograph. 10% was the most basic. The higher the synchronization rate, the higher the clarity of the photograph. In the end, he would even be able to see the microscopic world and see the various information left behind by others. In the future, he would even be able to see all sorts of invisible light, electromagnetism, sound waves, and other things that could not be seen by the naked eye. It could be said that 10% was just the beginning. As the synchronization rate continued to increase, Fang Xinjian would be able to see the world more and more clearly, just like how the resolution of a photograph would get increasingly higher. Only at this stage would he be able to go through a job transition and level up to level 20. From then on, there would be a threshold for the synchronization rate every 10%. It was just like how one would need 20% to reach level 21 at level 20. Each time he reached 10%, he would be met with a heavenly barrier. It would be like a tremendous flow of information, a disturbance from illusions, and a loss of control over one's emotions and desires. These were the 10 heavenly barriers. At each barrier, there would be conferred knights who would fall, and each barrier was extremely dangerous. However, this might not be the case for Fang Xinjian. For example, he had easily received the information bombardment at the first barrier. It was because his talent was unrivaled. Regardless of whether it was his brain's memory, reaction, willpower, or endurance, they were all outstanding. Looking at the ether synchronization rate on his stats window, Fang Xinjian smiled. He sensed slightly and could sense the over 100 streams of light in his brain. These were over 100 skill seed. He could finally start synthesizing skills. Chapter 194. Fang Xinjian could not wait to sit down and start preparing to synthesize his skills. Compared to ordinary geniuses who could be proud of having over 10 sets of skills, and those who could shake the world with tens of skills at the maximum level, Fang Xinjian had over 100 sets of skills at the maximum level. First is the nurturing sword techniques, combining all the nurturing sword techniques into one. Thinking of this, Fang Xinjian started considering which nurturing sword technique to use as his main skill. Looking at the School of Sword Arts nurturing sword manuals, and then at Treja's nurturing sword techniques, Fang Xinjian's gaze swept past them one by one, finally landing on his first set of sword techniques, the level 30 basic sword technique. Basic sword technique from Fang Xinjian's point of view, although this set of basic sword technique, which had been circulated in Demonic City, had average training effects, it indeed lived up to its name. It seemed to contain the most basic and simplest movements of all sword techniques, and was truly the foundation of all sword technique. He wanted to synthesize skills, to combine over 100 sets of nurturing sword techniques into one. This basic sword technique had the widest range and was the best choice. Therefore, he drew out the skill seed that represented the basic sword technique, and found another set of nurturing sword technique. This was the first set of nurturing sword techniques he had learned, the grizzly bear sword technique. The only use of this set of sword techniques was to provide Fang Xinjian with a few hundred potential points every day, and there were many other nurturing sword techniques that had the same effects as his own. The basic sword technique trained the entire body, although he did not go as deep into each part of the body as other nurturing sword technique. However, it was undeniable that it had a wider scope and greater potential. Therefore, he did not hesitate to control the grizzly bear sword technique skill seed, pressing it into the basic sword technique skill seed. With a boom, the grizzly bear sword technique skill seed merged into the basic sword technique skill seed like a drop of water. In the next moment, countless pieces of information seemed to intersect and merge in Fang Xinjian's mind. When everything calmed down, the skill seed representing the grizzly bear sword technique had completely disappeared. Fang Xinjian looked at the basic sword technique's introduction, but there were no changes. Did the synthesis fail? He tried to recall, but realized that he had already forgotten about the grizzly bear sword technique. The way he had used the grizzly bear sword technique just now was equivalent to deleting it. When the ether synchronization rate reached 10%, it meant that the success rate of synthesizing skills would be 10%. Therefore, the higher the ether synchronization rate after attaining heaven and man as one, the higher the level of the ether synchronization rate, the higher the success rate of synthesizing, and the stronger and more terrifying the skills would be. In the end, they would reach the level of Huang Lin, Jackson, and even the First Prince. 4 people like the First Prince who had reached level 29, his ether synchronization rate had already reached 100%, and the synthesis of skills would definitely succeed. All he needed was time to cultivate the skill to the maximum level. It was because only when a skill was at the maximum level would it mean that he was extremely familiar with the skill and had sufficient information about it. Only then would he be able to synthesize it. However, Fang Xinjian wasn't worried about this because he learned his skills very quickly. Even though the grizzly bear sword technique had failed, he did not sigh. Instead, he turned his gaze to the eagle sword technique. Then, with a sweep of his sword fingers, streams of sword cheese shot out, slashing at the stone wall at the side, causing the snow and stone fragments to scatter. He slashed out over 10 pictures of human figures waving swords, with annotations beside them. After doing this, Fang Xinjian once again sent the Eagle Sword Technique skill seed toward the basic sword technique skill seed. With a loud boom, the Eagle Sword Technique disappeared, but the basic sword technique still didn't change. The synthesis had failed again. As expected, with a synchronization rate of 10%, my understanding of the information in the ether particles is too rough. The success rate of synthesizing skills is also only 10%. It's too low. The ether synchronization rate represented the amount of information one could obtain from the ether particles in the surroundings. 10% of the information was very high. For example, when gathering information from the environment around one's body, one could only create a rough environment in one's mind. Similarly, the amount of information one could obtain from the ether particles in one's body was only 10%. Therefore, the success rate was very low. Most knights whose synchronization rate was below 50% would usually require a few months or even a few years to bring a set of skills to the maximum level. Of course, they would have to study and synthesize skills with great care and make difficult decisions. However, Fang Xinjian did not have such worries and troubles. It was because he was a fast learner. With the addition of skills and specialties time and time again, as well as the world's #1 sword arts talent, his learning speed had reached an astonishing level. While other people still had to choose carefully or even wait until they were at least level 25 before they had the confidence to start synthesizing skills on a large scale, and had to be very careful with each synthesis, Fang Xinjian was already casually synthesizing skills. He looked at the Eagle Sword Technique carved on the stone wall. After scanning through it for about a minute, there was an additional set of Eagle Sword Technique Level 1 on his stats window. Then, without drawing his sword, he used his fingers as a sword and started to practice the Eagle Sword Technique. He was still a little rough with the first sword, but he was already very familiar with the second sword. By the third sword, it was extremely smooth. By the time he reached the 10th sword, the Eagle Sword Technique in his hands was as if he had been practicing it for a few months. Just like that, he practiced the entire set of Eagle Sword Technique from start to finish, and the Eagle Sword Technique was once again at the maximum level of level 30. Fang Xinjian once again slapped the Eagle Sword Technique skill seed onto the basic sword technique. With a loud rumble, this time around, the Eagle Sword Technique disappeared, but the basic sword technique had an additional effect of allowing one to gain a maximum of 800 potential points every day. I've succeeded. The effect of the Eagle Sword Technique has been added onto the basic sword technique. Fang Xinjian smiled and swept out with his sword cheese, plowing away the layer of the stone wall which had been carved with the sword technique, turning it back into a smooth stone wall. He then started to carve a set of nurturing sword technique, the tenar-style body strengthening sword technique. Therefore, in the days that followed, Fang Xinjian stayed at the peak of the snowy mountain. When he was hungry, he would eat magic beans, and when he was thirsty, he would drink snow water. He started to cultivate and synthesize skills day and night. Compared to others who could only synthesize skills once every few months or years, he could synthesize a skill almost every few minutes. Therefore, after a week, he had already synthesized all the nurturing sword techniques into the basic sword technique, and all the training sword techniques into the 9-headed dragon sword technique. The synthesized 9-headed dragon sword technique was nothing much, as it was just a combination of a few sets of training sword technique. However, with the tempering method that combined the 5 major attributes, every time he cultivated this new 9-headed dragon sword technique, Fang Xinjian would be able to train any of the attributes he wanted, and his cultivation speed would also increase by 20%. What was amazing was the basic sword technique that had been synthesized from over 100 nurturing sword technique. He had combined the advantages of all the nurturing sword techniques, and every time he cultivated it, he would be able to nourish every single cell in his body. When he cultivated it, it was as if he was soaking in a hot spring, with every fiber of his being, every piece of his flesh and blood, desperately absorbing the nutrients and energy in his body. Its effect was even higher than the sum of all the nurturing sword technique. Originally, Fang Xinjian would at most be able to gain 11,000 potential points per day, but now that his physical body was automatically cultivating this new basic sword technique, he could gain 20,000 potential points. This efficiency was too terrifying. This meant that he would be able to increase his reaction attribute by a little every 3 to 4 days. This was also one of the reasons why conferred knights were getting stronger and stronger. Their nurturing techniques would usually go through many syntheses, becoming more and more suitable for their bodies. They would be able to dig out every bit of their body's potential, and their attributes would also grow to a terrifying level. Therefore, Fang Xinjian named this set of sword technique the Rebirth Sword Technique. This set of sword technique lived up to its name, and after cultivating it, it would have the effect of being reborn. Therefore, Fang Xinjian's skills now consisted of the Rebirth Sword Technique and the new 9-headed dragon sword technique, as well as the training technique. Then there were the 2 killing techniques, the Supreme Mistwind Sword Technique and the Radiant Light Sword Technique. There was also the Ether Sword Ripples, a technique that had evolved from his reduced force field due to the mutation of his mental cultivation method. With the nurturing technique and the training technique, there was nothing much left for him to do. Next was the problem of killing technique. First of all, Fang Xinjian had not learned the Ether Sword Ripples, so he could not possibly throw it out to synthesize. It would be gone if he forgot about it. Now, the problem was how to synthesize the Supreme Mistwind Sword and the Radiant Light Sword technique. Should he smash the Supreme Mistwind Sword onto the Radiant Light Sword technique or the Ether Sword Ripples? Or should he smash the Radiant Light Sword technique onto the Supreme Mistwind Sword or the Ether Sword Ripples? Fang Xinjian furrowed his brows and pondered for a moment. Then he suddenly smiled. The Supreme Mistwind Sword was a sword technique that controlled the atmosphere and was restricted by the limits of the air. In the future, it would not be of much use in second transition battles where one could easily surpass the speed of sound. Therefore, it was not suitable to be his main technique. As for whether he should use the Supreme Mistwind Sword to smash the Radiant Light Sword technique or the Ether Sword Ripples, that was someone else's problem. To Fang Xinjian, all he had to do was smash them all once. No, it could be more extreme. His plan was to first smash the Radiant Light Sword technique and the Supreme Mistwind Sword onto the Ether Sword Ripples. After the synthesis was successful, he would then learn the Radiant Light Sword technique and the Supreme Mistwind Sword, and then smash the Supreme Mistwind Sword onto the Radiant Light Sword technique. It was his fault for being a fast learner. As for the Ether Divine Arts Effulgence Weapon's special effect, it was only level 1 and could not be used for synthesis yet. Chapter 195. Therefore, Fang Xinjian started to synthesize skills one after another. He first smashed the Supreme Mistwind Sword and the Radiant Light Sword technique onto the Ether Sword Ripples. After succeeding, he continued smashing the Supreme Mistwind Sword technique onto the Radiant Light Sword technique. However, the cultivation of the Supreme Mistwind Sword and the Radiant Light Sword technique was not as fast as those nurturing sword technique. Usually, it would take 1 to 2 days for them to reach the maximum level of 30. Therefore, on the snowy mountain, in Fang Xinjian's mind, the skill seeds that represented sword techniques continued to collide with the Ether Sword Ripples skill seeds. With each collision, countless information would be exchanged, fused, and combined. This made Fang Xinjian feel like he was a human-shaped computer, with countless data flowing out like waterfalls in his mind. Just like that, he continued to cultivate sword techniques, synthesize skills, cultivate sword techniques, synthesize skills, and feel the repeated collisions between the skill seeds in his mind. Finally, when there was only half a month left before the regional selection, Fang Xinjian finally succeeded in synthesizing his skills. Other than being able to emit white sword light to confuse the enemy, the new radiant light sword technique could now also control the air currents to refract sunlight, moonlight, and other light sources to kill the enemy. Holding the demoness howl in his hand, Fang Xinjian did not dare to use too much strength to create a shrill sound on the snowy mountain. Therefore, he only swung the sword slowly, and the air currents encompassed the entire longsword. The next moment, a beam of sunlight gathered on the sword, and in that instant, it was reflected by an unknown amount of atmospheric water vapor. With a swoosh, as the sword pierced out, a beam of white light shot out from the tip of the sword, sweeping across the ground like a laser beam. It melted a large amount of snow water, causing white steam to fill the air. It was as if one had been brought from the snowy mountain to a hot spring. It can be refracted to kill the enemy? Fang Xinjian smiled. The speed of light was light speed, and the sword's refraction could create a high temperature of about 1000 degrees. This new set of sword technique was much stronger than the radiant light sword technique and the supreme mistwind sword. Moreover, this set of sword technique also maintained the supreme mistwind sword's ability to control the atmosphere. Fang Xinjian named this set of sword technique the luminous heaven soaring slash. And after the ether sword ripples were infused with the supreme mistwind sword and the radiant light sword technique, they also experienced a qualitative leap. The new ether sword ripples would still increase one's strength by 50% with each level of mental cultivation method, inheriting the cultivator's highest attack speed. However, at the same time, the ether sword ripples could change their frequency, just like light rays with different frequencies. It developed two special effects, low temperature and high temperature. Looking at the snow-covered land that had turned into a hot spring, Fang Xinjian tapped out with his finger, and over 10 streams of ether sword ripples, which brought with them an eerie chill, swept out. The temperature of the snow water dropped once again, turning it into ice water. Then he sent out over 10 streams of ether sword ripples across space. The surrounding air suddenly became scorching hot, once again raising the temperature of the snow water. Now that the ether sword ripples had the special effects of ice and fire, there was more room for battle. With that, after 2.5 months of cultivation, not only had Fang Xinjian completed his technique synthesis, his attributes had also increased through his daily cultivation. Over 1 million potential points had been allocated to his strength and reaction, and his waves had leveled up once again, reaching level 7. His attributes had also increased once again. Due to this period of peace and the fact that his ether synchronization rate had continued to increase, his mental cultivation method had finally leveled up once again, reaching level 5. Therefore, his attributes had now become: name, Fang Xinjian, age, 17, occupation, Wind Shadow Sword divinity level, 19 strength, 68 plus 5 agility, 193 plus 5 reaction, 79 endurance, 51 flexibility, 53 ether synchronization rate, 10%. The attributes above come into effect once the Sonido Sword Zephyr Waves is activated. Due to perfect muscles, plus 5 in strength and agility, 10% of the endurance attribute skills. Rebirth Sword Technique, New 9-Headed Dragon Sword Technique, Luminous Heaven Soaring Slash, Level 1 Ether Divine Art Specialties. Genius Swordsmanship, Elementary Survival Instinct, Internal Healing, Internal Training, Sword Specialist, Heightened Reflexes, Perfect Muscles, Elementary Berserkness, Unparalleled Sword Intent, Apex Waves Level 7 Sonido, Sword Zephyr Waves Mental Cultivation, Method Level 5. Universal Sword Dominance Lunisolar. Looking at how his abilities had once again improved by leaps and bounds, Fang Xinjian let out a breath. It's time to prepare to participate in the regional selection. Right now, Fang Xinjian finally had the confidence to participate in the regional selection and get first place, seizing the position of regional champion. At the next moment, Fang Xinjian's silhouette disappeared abruptly, turning into an afterimage as he dashed toward the south, toward the Great Western region, toward the location where the regional selection would be held. The city where the regional academy was located was also the place where countless top-notch characters from the Great Western region were gathered. This included the governor who managed all the knights in the Great Western region, the governor who managed all the knight academies, the regional governor who managed all the government departments, and the marshal who led all the armies in the Great Western region. In the center of the Great Western region, in the Great Western City. A few days later, Fang Xinjian climbed mountains and crossed rivers, cultivating as he made his way to the Great Western City. This city was 3 times bigger than Cursed and had a population of over 500,000 people. It was a great city where countless key departments and top-notch characters from all over the Great Western region were gathered. Sensing the liveliness of the city, Fang Xinjian broke into an excited smile. He would pass the regional selection here and become the regional champion. He would then rise up the ranks and attain the divine level. Finally, he would return to Demonic City and do what he should have done long ago. However, if he wished to participate in the regional selection, he would first have to register. Worried that he would be late for the registration, Fang Xinjian asked for directions as he headed in the direction of the regional selection in the Great Western City. Although the entire Great Western City was crowded, Fang Xinjian went up to the rooftops and leaped all the way. He would ask for directions when he did not know the way, and finally arrived at the registration place not long after the sky turned dark. He walked in and said to a receptionist, "I'm here to register for the regional selection." The receptionist was a young lady in her 20s. She wore a uniform and looked very tired. Although she was just an ordinary person, she was not surprised to see Fang Xinjian. It was because in a place like the Great Western City, knights were far too common. Moreover, the place she was at was the registration place. How many knights would have appeared before her? However, she shook her head and said, "You're too late. The registration period has long passed." Fang Xinjian frowned. "Isn't there still 15 days before the regional selection?" The young lady threw him a sideways glance and said unhappily, "The registration period started a month ago and will end half a month before the regional selection. Haven't you heard from the people in your academy?" However, she threw a glance at Fang Xinjian's tattered appearance and said, "Humph, you must have just returned after going out to train hard. Is that why the academy didn't inform you? But there's no other way. You'll have to wait for the next regional selection." How could Fang Xinjian possibly wait for the next regional selection? He frowned and said, "Is there any other way? I'm definitely going to participate in this regional selection." The young lady shook her head like a rattled drum. However, she seemed to have finally realized that Fang Xinjian had been talking with his eyes closed. She could not help but say, "Hey, aren't you being too rude by always talking to me with your eyes closed?" Fang Xinjian was stunned for a moment before he said calmly, "I'm blind and can't see anything." The young lady was stunned for a moment before a hint of fury flashed on her face. "Are you kidding me? You're blind and you're still registering for the regional selection? Don't you know that the regional selection requires the Pantheon Monument observation? Why are you registering for it?" Fang Xinjian frowned and said coldly, "I've already attained heaven's perception. Within a 10-meter radius, I can sense things even more clearly than with the naked eye." The young lady was stunned for a moment before she cried out involuntarily, You've attained heaven's perception? Doesn't that mean you can go through the second transition at any time?" Chapter 196. However, after the young lady finished shouting, she immediately looked at Fang Xinjian in disbelief. She stretched out her hand and waved it in front of his eyes, then suddenly asked, "What color clothes did I wear today?" In Fang Xinjian's heaven's perception, his synchronization rate was at 10%, which meant that he was able to receive the most basic 10% of information. It was mainly information related to vision and hearing. Could basically allow one to have clearer senses than seeing, and of course, it could also allow him to clearly see the situation within 10 meters around him. As for the area beyond 10 meters, Fang Xinjian continued to sense things through the wind and sound, just like in the past. He said calmly, "A blue short-sleeved uniform with blue pants." The young lady was surprised for a moment, then once again waved her hand in front of Fang Xinjian. "Are you really blind?" Suddenly, she thought of how if he had attained heaven's perception, he would be able to sense what she was doing. She immediately stuck out her tongue and said, "Wait here, I'll go ask the leader." With that, she jogged off. Heaven's perception. To think that there's another knight who has attained heaven's perception this year, and he's so young? Hearing the young lady's voice, the staff in the surroundings all looked over, looking at Fang Xinjian in astonishment and curiosity. Not long later, the sound of footsteps rang out, and a sweaty fatso walked over. When he saw Fang Xinjian, he shouted, "You said that you've attained heaven's perception?" Fang Xinjian could clearly sense that although the other party looked very ordinary, his strong muscles and powerful heart showed how strong he was. This fatso was a first transition knight. The young lady followed behind Fatso and shouted, "That's him! That's him!" Fatso placed his hands behind his back and asked, "How many are my hands?" Fang Xinjian could clearly sense that the other party's hands, which were hidden behind his back, had formed the shape of 11. He said calmly, "11. It's really heaven's perception." Fatso was still a little speechless. He looked at Fang Xinjian in astonishment and said, "How old are you? Which academy are you from? Why did you sign up so late?" 17 years old, Cursed Royal Academy. My name is Fang Xinjian. Oh, you're that Fang Xinjian. You've transitioned to a windstorm sword hero and killed a level 20 Garcia's destined warrior. It's a pity that you're blind now. Fang Xinjian did not expect the other party to have heard of his name. Fatso said, "My name is Valen, and I'm in charge of the registration for this year's regional selection." Sigh. Why did you only register now? You're already late. Aren't you a little too ambitious? He said with a pained expression, "If you're late for the registration, you won't be able to participate in the regional selection. At the very least, I don't have this authority." Sigh. Tonight is the 100-flower banquet, and the contents of the competition are going to be announced. You definitely can't register here. How about this? Follow me to meet Governor Devitt. He's in charge of the selection and assessment of all knights and conferred knights in the entire Great Western region. Only he has the authority to let you participate now. As he spoke, his eyes were filled with pity and anxiety, as if he was even more anxious than Fang Xinjian himself. "Where's the governor?" Fang Xinjian asked. Fatso and Valen said, "Today is the day the governor's wife is hosting the 100-flower banquet, inviting the various geniuses from the 12 regional academies. The governor and his wife must be in the manor now. Come, let's go look for them." As Fatso and Valen spoke, they had already dragged Fang Xinjian out. In an extremely huge manor located in the eastern suburbs of the Great Western City, it was currently filled with fireworks. Lights filled the entire mountains and plains, and there was an endless stream of horses and carriages at the entrance. There were gorgeously dressed young aristocratic ladies and handsome aristocratic young men everywhere. There were also some knights with oily faces, tall statures or skinny statures. This was the day the governor's wife, Madame Hathaway, would host the 100-flower banquet. It was also the banquet where the current geniuses would be gathered before each regional selection. "Look, that's Lord Delen from the Regional Secretariat. Look, that's Lord Fong Erluin from the Regional Finance Department." A young lady then pointed to a young man who was slowly walking down from the horse carriage. He was completely covered in black long robes, with only one of his eyes revealed, and said, "Look, that's Anderson from the South Mountain Academy." "He's that Anderson?" The first person in the Empire to transition into the Shadow Death God? That's right. Who would have thought that the South Mountain Academy would have hidden him for so long? The Shadow Death God. That's something that only someone from the previous kingdom had succeeded in transitioning into. If it wasn't because the temptation of this regional selection was too great, they would probably have continued hiding him until Anderson was fully prepared. His preparations are almost done. I heard that this Anderson has been in the first transition for 5 years. He has never used a second move against a knight before, and he's one of the hot favorites to become the champion this year. The young man, Anderson, seemed to have heard their conversation and glared at them coldly. The few people who were conversing felt their bodies turn cold, as if they had fallen into an ice cave. Amazing, amazing! Is this the Shadow Death God? To think that I can't move after just one glare. The few young ladies watched as Anderson left and immediately started chattering. The next moment, another wave of commotion rang out, as if another important character had arrived. All of a sudden, the sky was filled with flower petals, as if it was raining flowers. Then, amidst the fragrance, the crowd dispersed. A young man in white clothes and pants, with an unbelievably exquisite face and figure, slowly walked over. He looked like a god who had descended from the heavens to the mortal world. So handsome. Next to the young lady, another aristocratic lady shouted, "That must be the astral ancestor's third-generation disciple, Holt. It's said that he's also participating in the regional selection this time around." The third-generation disciple of a divine-level expert, which meant that he was the disciple of the astral ancestor's disciple. This was a very dazzling identity. And this divine-level expert's name was also very interesting, Astral Ancestor. However, everyone knew that there were no stars in Miracle World. Only some clans with ancient legacies would know that a very, very long time ago, there had been stars in Miracle World. However, for some unknown reason, they had all suddenly disappeared. Therefore, the name Astral Ancestor contained a hint of an ancient secret representing a very, very long legacy. All the aristocratic ladies present immediately looked toward Holt, as if they were wolves who had seen their prey. Among the crowd, Cursed Royal Academy's Rhoda mumbled, "Legend has it that all the Astral Ancestor's disciples must be handsome men and beautiful women. Those whose appearances and figures are slightly out of shape will be chased out of the sect. It seems that it's true." Manny laughed out loud and said, "Is that true? To think that there's such a thing." Ralph and Hamel turned their heads as well, as if this was the first time they had heard such gossip. However, the vice-headmaster, Edger, who was leading the group, immediately criticized, "Shut up. This is the great western city, not a small place like Cursed. You guys must be mindful of your image and not speak carelessly. You'll be throwing Cursed's face." Glaring fiercely at the few of them, Edger's brows furrowed again. This year's regional selection is really filled with crouching tigers and hidden dragons. To think that all the powerful characters have come out. Just then, a commotion broke out in the direction of the entrance once again, gathering toward that direction like a tidal wave. "What's wrong? What's going on?" Edger asked the people next to him what was going on. A knight said excitedly, "It's Master Llewellyn. Lord Holy Orizen's first disciple, Master Llewellyn, is here." Under the astonished gazes of Edger and the others, a middle-aged man dressed in white robes with a calm expression, who looked no different from any monk in a church, walked out slowly. At the same time, in the direction of the manor's hall, a silhouette flew past at high speed. It was Governor Devitt, who had come out to welcome him. Many spatial gaps were left in the sky as Governor Devitt appeared before Llewellyn in a flash, laughing as he gave him a hug. "Old friend, why have you come as well? Could it be that you're thinking of participating in the regional selection?" Devitt joked, but he knew that it was impossible for this second transition level 29 expert to participate in the regional selection. The reason why Devitt had come out to welcome him was not because of Llewellyn's status, but because he represented the holy orison, representing the prestige of a divine-level expert. Lord Devitt, you're still as vigorous as ever. Llewellyn smiled and said softly, As for me, I'm only here to look for someone. Chapter 197. Although Master Llewellyn's voice was not loud, he did not have the intention to hide it. Therefore, many knights present heard what he said. Therefore, after Devitt led Llewellyn in, the news that Master Llewellyn was here to look for someone spread out rapidly. Look for someone? Edgar was stunned. He suddenly recalled that over 3 months ago, Huang Lin had gone to the sacred mountain to look for the holy orison to treat Feng Xinjian. Back then, they had not thought that a divine-level expert would come out of seclusion for Feng Xinjian. However, the holy orison's eldest disciple had come to the great western city, saying that he was looking for someone. Rhoda let out a soft gasp and said, Could it be that he's here to look for Feng Xinjian? Edgar was the first to deny it. What kind of joke is this? What kind of status does Lord Holy Orison have? He's an existence who can affect the entire empire's situation with a single word. How could he possibly come out of seclusion to treat Feng Xinjian? Moreover, if he's looking for Feng Xinjian, he shouldn't have come to the great western city. Feng Xinjian has long since escaped to God knows where. Do you guys think that he'll come to participate in the regional selection? It's just a coincidence. Stop making wild guesses. Edgar did not believe that Llewellyn was here to look for Feng Xinjian. He led Rhoda, Hamel, and Ralph to the manor's hall. As for Manny, he could not be bothered with Edgar and left on his own. Edgar looked at the 3 genius students under him and reminded them again and again, Remember, don't forget the aristocratic etiquette that I've taught you guys. Otherwise, it's a small matter if you embarrass yourselves, but it's a big matter if you embarrass the academy. You might not even get to see such a grand scene in your entire lives. You must be careful. Under Edgar's lead, the 3 of them walked cautiously toward the manor's hall, feeling as if they were country bumpkins entering the city. On the way, they saw that the path was paved with white jade, and on both sides of the path were lamp posts with golden edges. There were over 100 lamps, illuminating the entire place as if it was daytime. There was also some kind of medicine added to the longevity lantern, which gave off a refreshing fragrance. Just smelling it would make one feel refreshed, and even their blood and chi would feel warm. This extremely extravagant style of a rich and powerful family caused the 3 of them to unknowingly become restrained. When had they ever seen such an imposing manor? Just the cost of building this section of the walkway would be enough to buy their entire family. Even Edgar, who was leading the team, became even more cautious. He lowered his head, not daring to look around. At this moment, another horse carriage stopped at the entrance. Cursed City Lord alighted from the carriage, dressed in formal attire. Following behind him was Lilia, who was dressed in an evening gown. The evening gown revealed a large area of snow-white skin on her chest and back. The lace at the sides of her dress and the little hat on her head made her look playful yet pure. Although her arms and legs were a little bulkier, when paired with Lilia's sweet face, she appeared even more lively and adorable. However, there was a hint of reluctance on her face. Cursed City Lord said softly, All right, Lily, don't throw a tantrum. Today is the day where the geniuses from the various academies gather. Later on, you should get to know the others and make friends. Not interested, Lilia said coldly. I'm not interested in talking to them. Cursed City Lord shook his head helplessly. Suddenly, his eyes lit up as he pointed to a man with white hair and a white beard, who looked extremely old and gloomy as he walked towards the hall. He said, Look at that. That's Wei Lung, the guy who has awakened heaven's perception at the first transition. Wei Lung's name had been extremely popular in the great western city for the past half a month. It was because he had awakened heaven's perception on his own before the first transition. His story was very simple, but also very sorrowful. For the past 10 years or so, Wei Lung had lived an ordinary life. He had learned martial arts like an ordinary knight, cultivated like an ordinary knight, found the daughter of a small aristocratic family, got married and had children. Then, he had lived an ordinary life. Other than the fact that he loved his daughter and his family very much, he had not revealed anything special about him. Until that day 1 month ago, when he had returned home, he had discovered that his wife, his daughter, and his parents had all died in a fire. That night, his hair had turned white, and he seemed to have aged 20 years. It was also that night that he had unexpectedly entered the realm that he had dreamed of, heaven's perception. Cursed City Lord shook his head in pity. How tragic! But to be able to comprehend heaven's perception without the help of resources before the first transition. He's indeed a talent. It's just that he hasn't been able to be unearthed in the past. He, that brat who transitioned into a shadow death god, and the astral ancestor's grand disciple. The three of them are now the most popular contenders for this year's regional selection. Lilia's lips twitched, but Fang Xinjian's image appeared in her heart. Cursed City Lord looked at the sorrowful look on Lilia's face and felt helpless. In order to make Lilia forget about Fang Xinjian, he had specially brought her here. Fang Xinjian had lost his sight and then disappeared after kidnapping Count. Without the Academy's support, and with no background, no one thought highly of his future. The father-daughter duo did not speak a word as they walked into the manor's main hall. They saw that the ceiling was filled with 4 to 5 meter long chandeliers, and up to 100 maids walking around, preparing food and drinks for each guest. Cursed City Lord suddenly smiled and shouted, "Ha ha, David, long time no see. You're getting more and more handsome. Uncle, you're the one. You feel like you've always been 30 years old. What a handsome man with an elegant demeanor." The person who had spoken was a young knight with a head of blonde hair combed to the back. He wore a knight's attire, and his eyes were like the ocean. He was the second son of Mongol City's City Lord, and was a family friend of Cursed City Lord. Cursed City Lord broke into a satisfied smile when he saw him. "You're also participating in the regional selection this time around?" "That's right. I probably won't be able to get into the top 3, but I'd still like to fight for the top 5. His words sounded humble, but the confidence and high spirits on his face were obvious. His eyes turned in Lilia's direction, smiling as he greeted her. "You must be Lilia? I remember that we used to play together when we were young?" Seeing that Lilia did not say anything, Cursed City Lord smiled, raised his wine cup and left. "I'll go greet a few acquaintances. It's Lilia's first time in the great western city. David, help me take good care of her." "Don't worry, Uncle." David smiled as he watched Cursed City Lord leave. He then said to Lilia, "Your father has the intention of matchmaking us, but you don't have to be so averse to it. Do I look that ugly?" Lilia rolled her eyes at him and said, "Don't talk to me, or else I'll call you molester." With that, she turned and left. David smiled and shook his head. Looking at Lilia's back view, he revealed an even more interested expression. He felt that this girl was very natural and not pretentious, different from those coquettish B***cheese he had met in the past. Therefore, he chased after her. Elsewhere, under Fatso and Valen's lead, Fang Xinjian finally arrived at the manor's entrance. Valen said to the guard, "We have something very important to discuss with Governor Devitt." The guard shook his head and said, "The 100 Blossom Banquet is being held today. Unless you have an invitation, no one is allowed to enter." As he said this, he looked at Valen and Fang Xinjian in contempt, clearly treating them as people who were trying to sneak in. Chapter 198. Valen said furiously, "It's really something very important." The guard's lips twitched as he smiled, and said to the ladies who were dressed up beautifully and would stick to aristocrats the moment they got off the carriage, "They also have something very important to attend to." Those ladies were clearly waiting outside the gate, looking for a chance to sneak in and find a rich husband. The guard had obviously treated them as such. Valen was enraged. He raised his fist, as if he was going to beat up the guard. However, seeing the guard's disdainful gaze and fearless expression, he eventually stomped his feet and did not do anything. Although the other party was just an ordinary person, he was the governor's guard. If he were to beat up this guard today, he would probably have to pack up and leave the great western city tonight. Just then, an aristocratic green-haired young man walked past the guard with a model-like female companion. He handed the invitation to the guard with an arrogant expression while throwing a cold glance at Valen and Fang Xinjian. When he saw that Fang Xinjian was dressed in rags and looked like a savage, he chuckled and said, "Haha, the 100 Blossom Banquet these days is really a place where just anyone wants to sneak in." The moment Fang Xinjian arrived at the great western city, he had gone to register and then brought the wine cup over. Of course, he had not had the time to wash up and dress up. Looking at the green-haired young man's back, Valen clenched his teeth and said to the guard, "Damn it, I'm Valen from the Regional Selection Office. I really have something very important to report to the Commissioner of Education." Fatso Valen pointed at Fang Xinjian and said, "He's a 17-year-old windstorm sword hero and has even attained heaven's perception. Do you guys know the value of this? If, because of you guys, he is unable to register and participate in the regional selection, do you guys know how big of a mistake it would be?" That guard was stunned for a moment and looked in Fang Xinjian's direction. However, he could not tell that Fang Xinjian was a genius who had attained heaven's perception at the age of 17. He looked more like a savage or a beggar. However, seeing that Valen was speaking with such sincerity and did not seem like he was faking it, the few guards exchanged glances and became hesitant. Willen said even more forcefully, "If you can't make the decision, get your leader to come. You can call Steward Sex of the manor. He knows me and knows that I won't speak carelessly." The guards looked at each other and nodded. One of them went to call the housekeeper over. Fang Xinjian frowned and asked, "Can't we just go in?" He casually glanced at the guards and said, "If we go in, they won't even be able to see clearly." Valen immediately covered his mouth and said, "What nonsense are you talking about? This is Governor Devitt's residence. For you to barge in recklessly, are you trying to get beaten to death?" They were different from people like Fang Xinjian, who were not afraid of anything. In the hearts of the natives of the Great Western region, the prestige of the governor, who was the #1 character in the Great Western region, had long been deeply rooted in their hearts. Who would dare to barge in recklessly? Therefore, Valen and Fang Xinjian could only wait at the side, enduring the strange and curious gazes from the nobles. Who are these two fellows? Haha, a grand fatso and a savage. They also want to participate in the 100 Blossom Banquet. On the other side, the atmosphere of the 100 Blossom Banquet in the hall was getting more and more enthusiastic. Young men and women from various aristocratic clans and geniuses from the 12 academies were chatting happily. The young man, who had transitioned into a shadow death god, was surrounded by men and women who were smiling and greeting him. They were clearly very curious about this genius, who was the only one in the empire so far. However, the young man wore a smug expression and would only reply once out of 10 questions asked. He was indescribably proud. He was the grand disciple of the divine-level expert, the astral ancestor. He had a handsome face and a slender figure. Each of his movements had an extremely elegant rhythm, causing countless aristocratic ladies, young ladies, and female students to surround him. Their gazes were filled with adoration as they looked at him. Clearly, this guy only needed to curl his finger slightly, and he would be able to get these women to take turns to climb into his bed. He was the only man in this batch who had awakened heaven's perception before the second transition. Similarly, there was no lack of people who were interested in him. However, most of them were aristocratic men who were above 30 years of age. They valued one's abilities more than their job titles and divine-level background. It was because the first two geniuses could only be befriended. He was the only one who did not have a strong background and was extremely talented. Therefore, there was a chance for him to be his subordinate. The elegant David moved through the ball with ease, greeting many young men and young ladies with great familiarity. He smiled and said to Lilia, "I know about you. I heard that you've fallen for a blind man? I think his name is Fang Xijian." Lilia turned her head abruptly, her eyes staring at David like a ferocious beast that had just awakened. "Say that again? It's the same even if I say it 100 times. David flicked his hair and smiled, saying, "A blind man will be a blind man. Moreover, he has already left the academy. With your status, it's impossible for you to." With a bang, Lilia punched out toward David's face. However, it was easily caught by his palm. His palm was fair and tender like a woman's palm. However, it contained an extremely terrifying power. It caught Lilia's fist easily and then clenched tightly. Lilia let out a stifled snort and retracted her palm abruptly, feeling a piercing pain coming from her small hand. David said coldly, "Women must learn to be obedient. In the future, if I find out that you're going to attack me again, it won't be as simple as today." As he spoke, he put out a hand and grabbed out toward Lilia. Lilia wanted to dodge, but she discovered that the other party's palm seemed to distort space and time. With a flash, he grabbed Lilia's back and lifted her up like a kitten. Lilia still wanted to struggle, but she discovered that with just a slight tremble of his palm, the force in her body dissipated. He then gently lifted her up and walked out. David's control over his strength was clearly extremely exquisite. Carrying Lilia like this, it looked as if he was hugging her. He gently shook her spine, making Lilia walk with him. David said in a low voice, "Lily, your father thinks highly of our future. Therefore, it's best that you don't do anything unnecessary. Sigh, after all, you've spent too much time in Cursed. How can you be compared to me, who's been living in the great western city since young? You don't understand how big this world is. Those geniuses in Cursed are just slightly outstanding ordinary people here." Lilia wanted to say something, wanted to shout out loud, but she discovered that a force had taken control of her throat, causing her to be unable to say a single word. Just as they were speaking softly, a female voice suddenly rang out, "Lilia, you're here too?" Lilia and David suddenly turned their heads and saw a valiant and formidable-looking lady. Anyone who saw her at first glance would only think of her as a heroine. It was Rhoda, one of Cursed Academy's 3 great geniuses. Rhoda's long hair was casually draped over her shoulders. Her long and slender thighs were wrapped up by a leather clip, revealing her fit and alluring figure. David's eyes narrowed slightly as he asked, "Lily, who is this?" Chapter 199. I'm Cursed Rhoda. Rhoda threw a glance at Lilia and David, a puzzled look in her eyes. Just then, Edgar had already rushed over with Hamel and Ralph. When he saw David, he grinned and greeted him. "Isn't this the son of Mongol City's city lord? Young Master David, you're here to participate in the 100 Blossom Banquet as well?" Seeing how submissive Edgar was, David lifted his head and said with slight arrogance, I'm going to meet Master Llewellyn. If there's nothing else, you guys can continue chatting later." With that, he left with Lilia. Before he left, he cast a long glance at Rhoda. Edgar said to Hamel and the other 2, "Look at him. This is the demeanor of a great aristocrat. I heard that David has been living in the great western region since young and has received the most elite education. Look at his disposition and actions. Sigh, but I heard that he's also going to participate in the regional selection this time around. He'll probably be able to get into the top 5. He turned to Hamel and said, "Remember, this David is probably even stronger than you. If you meet him in the competition, you must be careful." Rhoda asked doubtfully, "Lilia seems to be controlled by him? What has that got to do with you?" Edgar continued, "Remember, this is the Great Western region. Any young master could have a strong background and have quite a few conferred knights in his family. Be careful and don't cause trouble. Hamel said, I know. Right, he said that he's going to meet Master Llewellyn. Why don't we follow him? Hearing Hamel's words, excitement flashed in Edgar's eyes. That was the first disciple of a divine-level expert. It was said that his abilities were comparable to Governor Devitt's. Edgar nodded vigorously. Come. Let's also go listen to Master Llewellyn's teachings. On the other side, there were no longer any aristocrats entering or leaving. It was because everyone had entered the hall to participate in the banquet. There were also a few flirtatious cheese who had wanted to sneak in with the aristocrats, but were unable to do so. They smiled as they looked at Fong Xinjian, Fatso, and Willan. They wanted to rely on their youth and beauty to be fancied by some aristocrat so that they could be brought into the gathering and get to know the aristocrat. But now that the banquet had already begun, and everyone who should go in had already gone in, it was naturally hopeless for them to stay here. One of the short-haired girls said, Hey, you two, the reason you came up with to sneak in is too lousy. Haha, why don't you two look in the mirror? If you're going to attend a banquet, you should at least dress up. That's right. One is as fat as a pig, while the other is as dirty as a savage. Both of them want to attend the governor's banquet? After the girls finished speaking, they all burst into laughter. Obviously, they did not hear the conversation between Valen and the guards. Because they did not have the opportunity to do so today, they mocked Valen and Fong Xinjian, wanting to vent their anger. On the other side, one of the governor's stewards, Sex, was at the main entrance, giving orders to the servants. All kinds of famous wines, desserts, and fruits were being transported into the hall. After directing the logistics, Sex began to walk into the hall and inspect the work situation in the hall, constantly instructing the servants to solve any unexpected problems. After instructing the maids to send a drunk aristocrat young lady to the guest room, Sex came to the center of the hall and saw that Master Llewellyn was like the moon surrounded by stars, surrounded by countless aristocrats and geniuses. It was not just because he was a level 29 expert, but also because of the holy sea of truth behind him. As the #1 religion in the world, many aristocrats in the great western city believed in the church. In their eyes, Master Llewellyn was someone who carried the God of Truth's will. Master Llewellyn himself wore a benevolent expression, looking at everyone like he was looking at his own children. He did not say a word, merely listening to everyone's complaints and nodding occasionally. However, he also brought endless warmth and sunshine. Seeing this scene, Steward Sex could not help but slow down his pace. He wanted to meet this Archbishop of the Holy See of Truth, the eldest disciple of the divine-level expert, the Holy Orison. An aristocratic lady said, Master, why have you come to the great western city this time around? That's right, Master. Tell us. Let us help you. In the crowd, David, who had brought Lilia with him, Rhoda, who had followed Edgar, and the others all looked over. They were also extremely curious about why Master Llewellyn had come to the Great Western region. Unlike how he had not answered any of the questions in the past, this time around, Llewellyn opened his mouth. The moment he opened his mouth, a crisp sound like that of pearls falling on a plate rang out. This time around, I've come down the mountain under Master's instructions. I'm looking for someone. What? Lord Holy Orison is looking for someone? Who is Lord Holy Orison looking for? Is it an enemy? Master, quickly tell us who it is. We'll take action together. Even if we have to turn the Great Western region upside down, we'll definitely help Master find out who it is. Looking at the crowd's surging emotions, Llewellyn smiled and said, Everyone, don't be anxious. This time, I didn't come down the mountain to find an enemy. It's just that Master has been quiet for too long and wants to find a disciple. What? Lord Holy Orison is looking for a final disciple. To think that Lord Holy Orison is looking for a disciple. This is definitely earth-shattering news. To be able to become Lord Holy Orizen's disciple, even the regional selection doesn't matter. Hearing Master Yueluan's words, the atmosphere was immediately ignited, as if gasoline had been ignited. Anderson, who had transitioned into the Shadow Death God, raised his head. For the first time, an excited smile appeared on his cold face. He had transitioned into a first transition job that no one in the Empire had succeeded in for the past 200 years. Could it be that the Holy Orizen was here to look for him? David, who was still holding on to Lilia, narrowed his eyes and his heart thumped violently. If he could become the Holy Orizen's disciple, how could he just reach the heavens in a single bound? He would be second only to one and above all others. Uncontrollably, a look of ambition appeared in the depths of his eyes. Behind Edgar, Rhoda, Hamel, and Ralph were all agitated. The Holy Orizen's disciple, the successor to a divine-level expert. Which one of them did not want to become one? After hearing Yueluan's words, all of them puffed out their chests, as if wanting to attract Yueluan's attention. Even Edgar, who was already in his 40s, had a strange look in his eyes. Rhoda even shouted out directly, "May I know what specific requirements the Holy Orizen has in mind to take in a disciple?" That's right, what kind of disciple was he looking for? Everyone turned their burning gazes toward Yueluan, anticipating his answer. It was as if they would be lucky enough to be chosen. Seeing that Master Yueluan was about to speak, a young guard carefully squeezed in next to Steward Sex and whispered into his ear, "Lord Sex, there are two people by the name of Valen and Fang Xinjian who wish to meet the governor. They don't have an invitation, but they said." Steward Sex's attention was all focused on Yueluan, anticipating the other party to state the requirements for becoming a disciple. How could he have the energy to listen to the guard's report? He waved his hand and interrupted the guard, saying, "If they don't have an invitation, then tell them to scram. Why are they looking for me for such a small matter?" That guard looked at Sex with an aggrieved expression and said, "But that Valen said that Fang Xinjian is already, shut up and scram." After chasing the guard away, Sex continued to turn his gaze toward Master Yueluan. Yueluan said softly, "Everyone has misunderstood. This time around, I'm not heading down the mountain to help Master recruit a disciple. It's because Master has already decided on who his final disciple will be. I'm only here to bring him up the mountain." Chapter 200. What? To think that the divine-level expert, the Holy Orizen, had already decided on his disciple. Who was it? Who could it be? At this moment, be it Shadow Death God Anderson, David who was hugging Lilia, or even Hamel, Rhoda, Ralph, or even Edgar, all of them could not help but breathe heavily. Although they knew that the possibility of them being chosen was very low, humans were creatures that loved to fantasize. Otherwise, there would not be such a thing as a lottery. Therefore, although the possibility was very low, everyone could not help but feel anticipation, waiting for Yueluan to announce his name. A knight trembled and said, "I wonder who the Guardian King is going to take in as his disciple?" Yueluan smiled and said, "Cursed Royal Academy, Fang Xinjian. Cursed Royal Academy, Fang Xinjian." These words were like 10 bombs that were stuffed into Edgar's mind. His body trembled, as if he could not believe that the other party would say this name. He shouted, "What did he say? What did Master Yueluan say?" Only Rhoda remained calm, but her expression was still extremely complicated. She sighed and said, "Fang Xinjian, it's Fang Xinjian. The Guardian King is going to take in Fang Xinjian as his last disciple." Hamel and Ralph's expressions were also extremely complicated. There was disappointment, envy, but most of them were pure jealousy. There was no way they would not be jealous. To be taken in as a disciple by a divine-level expert. How fortunate and honored was this! How bright would one's future be! Even conferred knights would definitely be envious and jealous, let alone them. David, who had been grabbing onto Lilia, was also stunned. Fang Xinjian? That blind man, Fang Xinjian? Why is it him? Hints of cold, killing intent appeared in David's eyes, and maniacal jealousy surged up in his heart. Shadow Death God Anderson, who was at the back of the crowd, also frowned, thinking about what kind of person Fang Xinjian was. Holt, who was surrounded by countless young ladies and aristocratic ladies, as the grand disciple of the divine-level expert, the astral ancestor, naturally knew how important a divine-level expert was. Just like his identity as a third-generation disciple, he didn't even need to do anything himself. All kinds of resources, secret manuals, properties, and gold coins would be sent to him in an endless stream. Fang Xinjian? The one who transitioned into a windstorm sword hero? Holt smiled at ease. I wonder what kind of person he is. In any case, it was impossible for him to be accepted as a disciple by the Holy Orison again. Naturally, he would not be hostile towards this Fang Xinjian. On the other side, Steward Sex was stunned. Fang Xinjian? Fang Xinjian? He immediately came to a realization. Just now, his subordinate had told him that there was someone called Fang Xinjian waiting outside the door. Oh no. He immediately rushed out and rushed in the direction of the gate. Valen and Fang Xinjian were still waiting in the direction of the gate. The few young ladies at the side were already planning to leave. They looked at Valen and said, Hey, aren't you guys going together? Why are you still waiting here foolishly? Ha 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 ha. No one will be late for the 100 Blossom Banquet. I think you guys should go back earlier. It's a waste of time to wait. Just as the few young ladies were leaving and teasing Valen and Fang Xinjian, Steward Sex ran out hurriedly, following behind a few guards. The moment he came out, he looked in the direction of Fang Xinjian, Fatso, and Valen. Fatso Valen smiled and went up to him, saying, Steward Sex, long time no see. Do you still remember me? I'm Valen, the one who came here to meet the governor previously. I'm from the Regional Selection Office. However, faced with Valen's words, Sex did not react at all. With a slight turn of his body, he brought along a series of afterimages and passed by Valen, appearing right before Fang Xinjian, displaying the abilities of a knight. He looked at Fang Xinjian and said passionately, Are you young Master Fang Xinjian? Cursed Royal Academy's Fang Xinjian. Fang Xinjian replied, I'm Fang Xinjian. Sex immediately smiled, grabbed Fang Xinjian's hand passionately, and dragged him toward the manor, saying, Haha, this is great. Please come with me. Everyone's discussing you. Valen was blocked at the back and he shouted, Hey, hey, hey! Where's me? Fang Xinjian turned and lifted his chin in Valen's direction, saying, He's with me. Sex snapped his fingers, and Fatso and Valen were let in. The young ladies who were standing in a row outside the door looked at this scene with their eyes and mouths agape. Although they had not entered the upper class in the great western city, they had a good understanding of the various affairs of the aristocrat. The short-haired young lady who had been the first to tease Fang Xinjian said, That was Steward Sex, right? The governor's 3 stewards were all knights. Not only were they very strong, but they also had the backing of the governor. Another young lady gulped and said, I saw the regional regent's finance department's registrar being very respectful before him. Even Steward Sex was a little cold. What was going on earlier? What else could it be? That guy. Did you guys hear his name? Forget it, he must be an important character, an extremely important character. Otherwise, why would Steward Sex come out personally to welcome him? Did you guys see that smile on his face? Fang Xinjian. That guy's name is Fang Xinjian. I heard it clearly. Another young lady suddenly said anxiously, This is bad. We were joking with him earlier. He wouldn't remember us, would he? Thinking of this, the few coquettish cheese suddenly wore terrified expressions. Valen followed behind Sex, looking at the jade flooring on the walkway, the over 1,000 lampposts in the surroundings, and the various luxurious decorations. His eyes were filled with great astonishment. The 100-blossom banquet this time around was even more luxurious and beautiful than the manner he had seen previously. However, Fang Xinjian did not have much of a reaction. After all, although the people in Miracle World had strong martial prowess, they were at least several hundred years behind Earth in terms of architecture, decorations, and energy. The city center of any first-tier city was much more beautiful than this place. Therefore, how could Fang Xinjian possibly feel astonished? Just as they were walking, two people suddenly dashed out from the bushes. One was a green-haired aristocrat, and the other was a young lady who looked like a model. Their clothes were in a mess, and as they walked, they were still tidying themselves up. It was clear that they had been playing games in the bushes earlier. "Why have you come in?" The moment they came out and saw Fang Xinjian, they were shocked. They were just about to shout when they saw Sex, who was next to Fang Xinjian. Sex frowned and said, "Young Master Gable, please mind your status." The other party was the governor's wife, Miss Hathaway's family. Although he could not stand his behavior, he could not reprimand him too much. The green-haired young man scratched his head awkwardly, clearly a little afraid of this steward. However, he immediately pointed at Fang Xinjian and said, "Steward Sex, why did you bring this person in? He's a hooligan who wants to sneak into the 100-blossom banquet." He had even despised Fang Xinjian at the entrance earlier. How could he have expected to meet him here, and for him to see such an embarrassing scene? Sex frowned and said solemnly, "Young Master Gable, please don't spout nonsense. This young Master Fang Xinjian is Master's honored guest, the person Master Yueluan is looking for." With that, he continued to welcome Fang Xinjian in with an enthusiastic expression. When Valen passed by, he even rolled his eyes at the green-haired young man, revealing a disdainful expression. Seeing the three of them leave, the green-haired young man was left in a daze, not knowing what on earth had happened. "This won't do. Where on earth did this guy come from? I'm going to follow him and take a look. If he managed to sneak in through some means, I'll kill him." Chapter 201. After Yueluan said the holy orison, wanting to take in Fang Xinjian as his disciple, he looked at the hall which had erupted into an uproar, smiled and said, "I heard that Madame Hathaway is holding the 100-blossom banquet, inviting all the genius students from the 12 academies in the Great Western region. Fang Xinjian has transitioned into a windstorm sword hero and should be considered a genius from Cursed Royal Academy. That's why I'm here to look for him." From afar, a lady who appeared elegant and mature, but whose face and figure were maintained like that of a young lady in her 20s, smiled and said, "The 100-blossom banquet will naturally invite all the talents from the Great Western region. It's to allow the elites of the Great Western region to gather together and have a good exchange, and also to announce the contents of this year's regional selection." Saying that, Hathaway looked toward the crowd and asked, "I wonder where Fang Xinjian is?" As she spoke, her lungs trembled, as if there were waves of vigorous energy vibrating the air, easily transmitting each of her words into everyone's ears. Everyone quietened down, as if they wanted to see how a genius who could transition into a windstorm sword hero and be highly regarded by a divine-level expert would look like. Lilia was also agitated, her eyes darting around. She was excited that Fang Xinjian had been taken in as a disciple by a divine-level expert, but she was also looking forward to whether Fang Xinjian would come to this banquet. This was her true motive for coming to the 100-blossom banquet. However, amidst the silence, no one stepped out. Hathaway called out again, but seeing that no one stepped out, she immediately frowned and asked directly, "Are there any people from Cursed Academy here today? Which one of you is from Cursed Academy? Please raise your hand." This time around, Edgar could no longer pretend that he had not heard. He slowly raised his hand helplessly, and immediately saw countless fiery gazes looking toward him. Hathaway looked at him and asked directly, "Who are you? Where's Headmaster Jackson? Is Fang Xinjian not here?" Edgar gulped. When had he ever been the center of attention of so many influential people in the great western city? He felt that, under the countless gazes, his entire body felt a little weak. Especially Hathaway's gaze. That was the governor's wife. He replied nervously, "Headmaster Jackson has fallen ill and is recuperating in Cursed. I'm the deputy headmaster Edger, and I'm here to attend the banquet on behalf of Headmaster Jackson." That Fang Xinjian. At the mention of Fang Xinjian, his face flushed red, and he felt extremely awkward, unable to advance or retreat. He did not know what to say at all. Was he supposed to say that Fang Xinjian was missing? Pushed away. In front of all the aristocrats in the entire great western city, Cursed Royal Academy was labeled as incompetent, lacking in control, and lacking in teaching capabilities. Hathaway asked impatiently, "What's going on? Don't you even know how to speak?" Edgar hemmed and hawed, but he couldn't say a word. Just as Edgar was in a dilemma and Hathaway's gaze was getting colder and colder, Sex finally brought Fang Xinjian to the main hall. He smiled and said, "I'm sorry, madam. There's been a misunderstanding, and that's why young Master Fang Xinjian has come in." In that instant, Sex attracted everyone's gazes. Everyone's gazes went past this steward and landed on Fatso, Valen, and Fang Xinjian, who were behind him. Fatso and Valen did not seem to be related to the Windstorm Sword hero. Moreover, as an official of the great western city, he was naturally recognized by many people present. Hathaway smiled, looked at Fang Xinjian and said, "You're Fang Xinjian, Curse City's Windstorm Sword hero?" Therefore, everyone's gazes gradually gathered on Fang Xinjian. Looking at this young man with disheveled hair and a dirty face, dressed in rags, and looking like a beggar, the aristocrats could not help but have expressions of ridicule, mockery, envy, or admiration. All sorts of emotions, along with jealousy, were directed towards Fang Xinjian. "This is Fang Xinjian? Haha, I can't tell what's so special about him. Where did this guy come from? He looks like a savage. He's not even comparable to me. What right does he have to become the disciple of a divine-level expert? What do you know? It's obvious that he's just returned from tough training. It's true that behind every successful person, there are countless hardships and hard work. If it was said that the others were only feeling jealous and envious, then David and Shadow Death God Andre's gazes were filled with jealousy and killing intent as they looked at Fang Xinjian. Becoming the disciple of a divine-level expert was something that would attract too much hatred. However, what kind of person was Fang Xinjian? He was blind. Therefore, he acted as if he did not feel anything and looked straight in the direction of the lady who had spoken earlier, Hathaway. Although he was unable to see beyond 10 meters, he could still hear where the voice had come from. He closed his eyes and looked at Hathaway, saying, "I'm Fang Xinjian." Looking at Fang Xinjian's closed eyes, Hathaway said, "I heard that you were poisoned in the battle with Garcia's destined warrior. Have your eyes recovered yet?" Fang Xinjian said calmly, "No." Hathaway smiled and said, "But that's fine. You should remember this day. It's your lucky day." Hearing that Fang Xinjian was blind, the jealousy and envy in everyone's eyes grew even stronger. Everyone knew that the Holy Orison was the only one among the 10 divine-level experts in the Empire who specialized in healing. Not only was he able to be taken in as his disciple, but he could also treat his eyes. How great of an honor was this! Everyone looked at Fang Xinjian, wishing that they could replace him. Edger's body trembled incessantly, as if he had been knocked out by waves of bombs. He was also excited and astonished that Fang Xinjian was about to be taken in as a disciple by a divine-level expert. However, he also felt uneasy and afraid because he had not valued Fang Xinjian and had ostracized Fang Xinjian in the past. These two emotions filled up his body at the same time, making him feel as if he had been injected with chicken blood. When Fang Xinjian heard Hathaway's question, he felt a little puzzled. He was really puzzled because he did not know that the divine-level expert, the holy Orozen, was already planning to take him in as a disciple. Seeing Fang Xinjian's puzzled expression, Hathaway turned and looked at Master Yueluan. However, she frowned slightly. It was because Master Yueluan's gaze was fixed on Fang Xinjian, as if he had seen something unbelievable. It was only when Hathaway coughed softly that Master Yueluan regained his senses. However, his gaze when looking at Fang Xinjian was still a little strange. How is this possible? How is it possible that they are so alike? Is this a coincidence or, at this moment, he suddenly had a terrifying conjecture about why his teacher had asked him to take in Fang Xinjian as his disciple. However, he was a level 29 great expert after all. Therefore, there were no changes in his expression. He looked at Fang Xinjian with a benevolent expression and said, "Fang Xinjian, my teacher is the holy Orozen. After seeing your information, teacher is very interested in your situation. I wonder if you're willing to follow teacher and learn and cultivate on the sacred mountain?" In that instant, everyone's gazes were focused on Fang Xinjian, waiting for his reply and waiting for this historic moment. Chapter 202. However, unlike what everyone had expected, Fang Xinjian did not agree right away. He did not let joy get to his head and replied excitedly. His expression remained calm. Amidst the silence, he asked calmly, "May I know what your request is?" Hearing this question, everyone looked at Fang Xinjian with their eyes and mouths agape. What was he asking? To think that he was asking a divine-level expert if he had any requests for him to be his disciple? Did he think that this was a private tutor collecting tuition fees? However, Master Yueluan's face still wore an extremely affectionate smile. He walked slowly up to Fang Xinjian and said, "Child, don't think too much. Teacher won't have any requests from you when he's taking in disciples. If there's anything, it'll be that you must stay on the sacred mountain and cultivate for 5 years. After the 5 years are up, you must pass teacher's assessment before you can leave the mountain. This will save teacher's reputation." "I have to stay on the mountain for 5 years? Must I stay for a full 5 years? Hearing that, Fang Xinjian's brows furrowed fiercely. Yueluan was stunned for a moment, as if he had not expected Fang Xinjian to be so conflicted over this question. By right, no matter what kind of genius one was, upon hearing that a divine-level expert wanted to take them in as a disciple, they should have agreed excitedly. Why was it that this kid was still looking as if he was worried that they would scam him out of his money? Yueluan shook his head and gave it some thought. Thinking that he had seen through Fang Xinjian's worries, he said, "Do you have any relatives or friends? It's fine. You can bring them up to the sacred mountain." If it were an ordinary person, Yueluan would have ignored him after his repeated hesitation. However, when he saw Fang Xinjian's face, he could not help but go along with the other party's wishes out of habit. When Fang Xinjian and Yueluan were conversing, everyone's eyeballs almost popped out from shock as they looked at the two of them in disbelief. Master Yueluan was very polite and enthusiastic to Fang Xinjian, as if he was his own son. Was this still the holy Orozen's chief disciple that they knew? When David saw Fang Xinjian and Yueluan's expressions, he felt as if his lungs were about to explode. He wished that he could replace them and prove that he was Fang Xinjian. Hearing Yueluan's reply, Fang Xinjian shook his head. "I have things to do. I can't stay for 5 years." He thought about it, but in the end, he still didn't reveal his two biggest secrets, that he only had 4 years left to live and that he needed to take revenge. This was too inappropriate, very inappropriate. Once he revealed it, there would be too many variables. Upon hearing Fang Xinjian's answer, Yueluan seemed to be extremely surprised. However, he wouldn't give in on this point. He replied seriously, "During the 5 years that I've been on the mountain, I have to fast, bathe, and burn incense daily. This is the customary rule of the Holy Sea of Truth. Even when teacher first came here, he didn't change it. Only the traitors of our sect would descend the mountain early. Hearing this reply, Fang Xinjian fell silent. He was contemplating whether he should continue to participate in the regional selection and advance to the national selection, or join the Holy Orison and betray them when he was strong enough. Just as Fang Xinjian was silent, the gazes of the people around him became even stranger. Was this Fang Xinjian a fool? To reject a divine-level expert? What on earth was he thinking? Many people had the urge to rush up and agree to it on Fang Xinjian's behalf. Edgar could not care less and jogged toward Fang Xinjian, criticizing him. Fang Xinjian, are you a fool? The Guardian King wants to take you in as his disciple, and that's your good fortune. What are you still hesitating for? Hurry up and agree to it. He really wanted to press down on Fang Xinjian's head and agree immediately. How great of a good thing was this? It was not only good for Fang Xinjian but also for Cursed. For a student to be specially sent by a divine-level expert to be taken in as a disciple. How great of a publicity would this be for Cursed Academy? How great of a reputation would this be? Cursed Academy would definitely become famous in the entire empire. Who knew how many people would rush here to participate in the prefectural selection and then join Cursed Academy? Moreover, this was in front of almost half of the aristocrats in the great western city. Edgar felt that he had gained a lot of face by giving Fang Xinjian such guidance. In the future, if word were to spread that it was under his guidance that Fang Xinjian had turned over a new leaf and joined the Holy Orison, how much face would he gain? It would be a legendary story between a teacher and a disciple. How could someone like Edgar, who cared a lot about his reputation, not be overjoyed? However, faced with Edgar's criticism, before Edgar could even feel happy for even a second, Fang Xinjian lifted his leg and kicked him in the chest. With a bang, Edgar was sent flying out of the crowd. He said impatiently, long-winded. How much had his strength improved after almost 3 months of tough training? How fast had his speed been? Especially after attaining heaven's perception, he could see everything within a 10-meter radius even clearer than with his eyes. Coupled with the use of unparalleled sword intent, apex, he had instantly hit Edgar's flaw. Edgar had not put up his guard at all. He had not expected that Fang Xinjian would attack him in front of so many aristocrats. Who would have thought that Fang Xinjian would be so daring? When he had been attacked, he had been in a daze. It was only when he had knocked into a dining table and all sorts of soup and water had splattered all over him that he came to his senses. However, it was already too late. Even though he had used his reduced force field to get rid of the rubbish around him, he was still drenched. There was even a big footprint on his shirt on his chest. The gazes of the several hundred aristocrats in the surroundings were looking at him, and it was as if they were beams of lasers filled with killing intent. Edgar cherished his reputation so much that he had lost face before all the aristocrats in the great western city. He was so embarrassed and infuriated that his face was flushed red. He could not even stay for a second longer. He let out a furious bellow and dashed out of the hall and the manor, not daring to meet the gazes of any of the aristocrats. However, his actions did not attract too much attention. After thinking for a long while, Fang Xinjian still replied, "My minimum limit is 2 years. Within 2 years, I must leave the mountain." Yueluan shook his head. "There's no precedent for this in the Holy See of Truth." Fang Xinjian shrugged. "Then I can only apologize. I won't be able to go to the sacred mountain to study." Valen finally had the courage to interrupt, saying, "Fang Xinjian, are you crazy? You're rejecting the Guardian King?" He quickly said to Master Yueluan, "His mind isn't clear and he's turned into a fool from cultivating. Let him think about it carefully." However, Fang Xinjian was unmoved. Master Yueluan's brows furrowed as he looked at Fang Xinjian's face. That familiar feeling caused him to be in a daze. He smiled and said, "Since that's the case, then I won't force it. Let's just leave it to fate." David looked at this scene and felt extremely excited. He thought that Fang Xinjian was really a rotten wood that could not be carved. To think that he had rejected such a good opportunity and ended up offending Master Yueluan instead. The host of the banquet, Hathaway, also frowned slightly. She felt that Fang Xinjian really did not know how to appreciate favors and had destroyed the good atmosphere of the banquet. The astral ancestor's grand disciple looked at Fang Xinjian and smiled with interest, as if he was looking at a weirdo. Interesting. Haha, this Fang Xinjian is dead meat. To think that a blind man dares to be so arrogant? To think that he rejected the Guardian King's invitation. He's AB****. If he were to participate in this year's regional selection, I'll definitely kill him to atone for his sin of looking down on the church. Just then, Fang Xinjian spoke again. May I ask where the governor is? I wish to participate in this year's regional selection, but I'm late for the registration. Hearing Fang Xinjian's words, everyone looked at Fang Xinjian as if they were looking at a fool. An idiot who had rejected a divine-level expert, a blind man, and a knight who was late for the registration. To think that he still wanted to participate in the regional selection? Everyone was waiting for Governor Devitt's reply, looking forward to how he would humiliate this Fang Xinjian. Chapter 203. In the past, Governor Devitt had supported this Fang Xinjian, but he had done so because of the extraordinary aptitude the other party had displayed. But now the other party was just a blind man. What right did he have to ask for his help? Moreover, the other party had just rejected the Holy Orison's invitation in front of so many people. If Devitt were to agree to the other party's request, he would be making things difficult for Yueluan. Of course, the most important thing was that the other party was late. In this aspect, Fang Xinjian was not in the right at all. Therefore, Devitt only smiled and said, Xinjian, I understand your feelings. But there's a deadline for the registration. This is the rule. Today, the 100 Blossom Banquet will announce the contents of this year's regional selection. These are the contents that we've come up with based on the current registrant. We can't change them easily. David glanced at Lilia, who was at the side, and said with a smile, This is the person you like? Not only is he a fool, but he's also a good-for-nothing. You can just stay here and watch as he gets humiliated by so many people. Lilia's face was filled with dissatisfaction, but when she looked at Fang Xinjian, her gaze was filled with pity. However, just as Devitt finished speaking and Fang Xinjian was frowning, Valen immediately stood up and said, Sir, although Fang Xinjian is late, he has already attained heaven's perception. Please allow him to participate in this year's regional selection on account of his talent. Hearing the words heaven's perception, everyone present looked at Fang Xinjian in astonishment, as if they were getting to know him all over again. Today's events had been full of twists and turns. First, the head disciple of the divine-level expert, the Holy Orison, had appeared and said that he wanted to invite Fang Xinjian to the sacred mountain to cultivate. But then, Fang Xinjian had rejected him and wanted to register for the regional selection despite being late. Just as everyone thought that he would not be able to participate, it was revealed that Fang Xinjian had already attained heaven's perception. The entire incident was like a roller coaster, going up and down, incessantly stimulating the eyes of the many aristocrats present. What? David's eyes were wide open, as if they were going to pop out. He stared at Fang Xinjian, unable to understand how he had managed to attain heaven's perception in just a few short months. Shadow Death God Anderson and the divine-level expert's grand disciple also looked at Fang Xinjian in astonishment. Holt took the peeled grapes from the girl and smiled. Oh, the Great Western region is really filled with talents this time around. There are already 2 geniuses who have stepped into heaven's perception consecutively. In the entire hall, probably only Wei Lingcai, who had only awakened his heaven's perception after he had reached middle age and experienced a great change, did not notice any of this. He sat quietly in a corner of the hall, continuing to immerse himself in his sorrow. Most of the others had similar reactions. They were all surprised, shocked, and had a hint of disbelief in their eyes. Fang Shijian was really too young to be able to awaken heaven's perception at such a young age, even before the regional selection. What kind of talent was this? Simply amazing was not enough to describe it. One must know that Wei Lung had cultivated for tens of years, and had only suddenly comprehended it after encountering a great change. Of course, the prerequisite was that all of this was real. Therefore, just as Devitt's gaze changed slightly, someone tactfully stepped out and said what Devitt wanted to say. It was the green-haired aristocratic young man who had tailed Fang Xinjian all the way here. He was the guy known as young Master Gable. Gable looked at Fang Xinjian suspiciously and said, "You said that you've attained heaven's perception? Then prove it to us." Just then, a cry rang out. It was Lilia's cry. David had focused all his attention on Fang Xinjian, and in a moment of carelessness, Lilia had managed to break free from him with her monstrous strength. Almost at the same instant that Lilia cried out, Fang Xinjian moved. Although he was blind, and even if he had attained heaven's perception, he would only be able to sense within a range of 10 meters. The luminous heaven-soaring slash had allowed him to retain the ability to control the flow of the atmosphere and sense the area within a range of 100 meters. Therefore, he had always been very clear about how many people were standing in each location in the hall. Lilia's cry also allowed Fang Xinjian, who had an extremely sharp sense of hearing, to instantly recognize her. Therefore, with a flash, he appeared behind Lilia and held her back. He then used heaven's perception to look in David's direction. "Lilia? Why are you here as well?" With that, Fang Xinjian saw the bruises on Lilia's body through heaven's perception. He did not feel any heartache, but he felt fury. He turned to look at David. Lilia hugged Fang Xinjian tightly, burying her head into Fang Xinjian's chest like a little child. The corners of her lips curled up uncontrollably, feeling an indescribable happiness. "It's so strange. Why is it that when I hug teacher, I feel so sweet in my heart? It's like I've eaten nectar." When David saw Lilia hugging Fang Xinjian with a blissful expression, his eyes turned red as he stared at Fang Xinjian. Seeing that everyone was looking in their direction, he was not willing to back down. He revealed a rich aristocratic smile and said, "Fang Xinjian, great genius Fang, Lilia is my fiancée. Isn't it a little inappropriate for you to hug her like this?" "Not a little inappropriate." Fang Xinjian fell silent for a moment before saying to the green-haired Gable, "Don't you guys want me to prove that I've attained heaven's perception? Then let's use this guy to prove it." He pointed at David. Ignoring the grim expression on David's face, Fang Xinjian said to him directly, "I'm going to make a move on you. You can try and see if you'll be able to escape." This was the 100 Blossom Banquet, a gathering of countless aristocrats and geniuses. David felt that he was one of the top 5 candidates in the regional selection, so how could he allow himself to be humiliated by Fang Xinjian? Hearing Fang Xinjian's words, he let out a cold laugh and took a step forward. A mountainous aura gushed out from his body, pressing down on Fang Xinjian. This was the killing technique, one-man army, which David had painstakingly cultivated for many years. It emphasized on the cultivation of one's aura, using one's aura to suppress one's enemies and attack one's spirit. Above that, one could directly control the atmospheric pressure, using the atmosphere to press down on others, causing them to fall to the ground, unable to get up. When ordinary knights were faced with the pressure from his aura, they would usually have their minds taken away, just like how Lilia had been earlier, unable to speak and being controlled by him as he wished. It was as if she was being held down by a ghost. Even if their minds were not taken away, they would usually be suppressed by the aura to the point that their limbs were tied up, unable to unleash even half of their powers. His highest record was when he had punched out with a single punch. The terrifying atmospheric pressure had pressed down on 7 knights, causing them to be like toads crawling on the ground. They had not been able to get up for a whole 3 hours. However, what kind of person was Fang Xijian? He had not backed down even when facing the divine-level expert Li Shuanghua and the conferred Knight Jackson. How could he possibly back down before David? Fang Xijian did not say anything. He just let go of Lilia and slowly walked toward David. The crowd in the surroundings immediately dispersed, looking at Fang Xijian and David as if they were watching a show. The Empire's martial arts culture was too strong, and the people in high positions were basically all knights or conferred knight. It was too common for fights to break out in gatherings because of a single disagreement. The crowd had long since gotten used to it, and no one stopped them. They just looked at Fang Xijian and David, guessing the outcome of this round. David did not show any signs of weakness. He grabbed out with his fists across space, and it was as if 2 great mountains had appeared out of thin air, wanting to press down on Fang Xijian. It was a heavy pressure from the aura and atmospheric pressure, both mentally and physically. Chapter 204. After Fang Xijian's body was restricted by the atmospheric pressure, his footsteps came to an abrupt halt. Kacha-kacha sounds seemed to ring out in the air, as if the air had been crushed like steel. Seeing that Fang Xijian had stopped in his tracks, David burst out laughing and sighed inwardly. Humph, no matter how fast you are, the atmosphere in space is omnipresent, and the transmission of my aura to one's spirit is instantaneous. Will you be able to dodge it? As he thought of these, David clenched his fist fiercely, and a sound that was like an air bomb rang out. The atmospheric pressure on Fang Xijian grew even stronger, and he felt as if every inch of his skin was being pressed down by a mountain. David said coldly, "Fang Xijian, if you surrender now, I'll let you off. Otherwise, don't blame me for being ruthless." Hearing that, Fang Xijian lifted his head and looked at David, revealing a hint of a disdainful smile. "I'm coming over. If you can fend me off, then go ahead and try it out." At the next moment, ether sword ripples exploded abruptly, slashing apart the surrounding air. At the same time, Boundary's negation was activated, and with a single step, he appeared before David. David's reaction was very fast as well. Although he did not understand how Fang Xijian had managed to break free from his suppression, at the instant Fang Xijian disappeared, David struck out with both his fists, causing the air to explode. The endless atmospheric pressure was like a gate that weighed 1,000 caddies, pressing down fiercely toward David. The defense of this air gate was extremely strong, and David had even used this move to fend off ballistae. However, almost at the instant he released the air gate, Fang Xijian's finger was like a ghost, tearing through the air, piercing through the weakest point of the air gate and heading toward David's head. Right now, Fang Xijian had the support of the unparalleled sword intent Apex. He could even slash through inferior divine weapons with his bare hands, let alone David's air gate. David cried out in surprise. He tilted his head back and put his palms together. Immediately, boundless air was squeezed toward his body, forming an extremely tight air shield that protected his entire body. However, although the defense of the air armor was amazing, it also limited David's movement. So, although David was full of confidence when he used this move, he knew that he could not defeat Fang Xijian. This Fang Xijian is really amazing. Could it be that he really has heaven's perception? If it's really under heaven's perception, then it's even more amazing than what we can see with our naked eyes. In addition to his elusive sword techniques, I wonder how he cultivated them? However, he was very confident in his atmospheric armor. He watched as Fang Xijian's fingers pressed down on him. However, as soon as they got within 3 inches of Fang Xijian's body, their speed would become slower and slower. In the end, they would be pushed away by the high-density air. Seeing this scene, he smiled even more confidently. "It's useless, Fang Xijian. This atmospheric armor of mine is something that even knights who use level 9 inferior divine weapons won't be able to slash through. It can be said to be the strongest defense at the knight level. Do you understand? That's the power of the atmosphere, the tremendous power of the heavens and the earth. Unless you've reached the second transition, it's impossible for you to go up against the power of the heavens and the earth. Other than sensing information from ether particles, the second transition also required one to be able to borrow the power from ether particles. The power from ether particles was endless, representing the great power of the heavens and the earth. However, killing techniques that borrowed the power from ether particles were all cultivated by conferred knights and were usually concentrated in the regional academy. Naturally, Fang Xinjian had not learned them before. However, he clearly did not give up. With a lift of his hand, streams of light spots appeared. He activated the high-frequency effulgence weapon, Silver Fox. A long sword formed from silver fog appeared in his hand. To think that he possesses an effulgence weapon before even going through the second transition at level 19? What's the use of having an effulgence weapon? David's atmospheric armor had once single-handedly fended off the joint attack of 12 knights. It can be said to be truly indestructible among those below the second transition. It's a pity, what a pity. If this Fang Xinjian had an inferior divine weapon, it would still be fine. But it's impossible for him to slash through the atmospheric armor with his bare hands. Divine-level Grand Disciple Holt shook his head and touched the longsword at his waist subconsciously, saying, "This atmospheric armor is quite famous. If I were to use my bare hands, it would probably be harder for me to break through it. This killing technique of forming an army of one man is really exquisite. It already has the hint of a second transition, knight borrowing the power from ether particles." Rhoda frowned as well. She suddenly looked at Hamel and said, "Give him your superior divine weapon." What? Hamel was shocked and did not react in time. The superior divine weapon that Huang Lin had requested Governor Devitt to forge had been lent to Hamel due to Edger's attention. Hearing Rhoda's words, Hamel frowned, clearly very unwilling to do so. Governor Devitt and his wife Hathaway also shook their heads, clearly thinking that it was impossible for Fang Xinjian to break through the atmospheric armor. Just as everyone thought that it was impossible for Fang Xinjian to break through the atmospheric armor, Fang Xinjian moved. Under everyone's gazes, the fog-like high-frequency effulgence weapon, Silver Fox, pierced out lightly, tapping on the atmospheric armor. The high-frequency tremors, coupled with the reinforcement from the unparalleled sword intent, Apex, sent an extremely terrifying sharp aura soaring into the air, tearing through layers of the atmosphere. Then, under David's incredulous gaze, it broke through the atmospheric armor and tapped on David's body. Almost at the same instant that the atmospheric armor was broken, the intense change in air pressure caused a large amount of air to explode and scatter out in all directions. Amidst the air currents from the explosion, David took the opportunity to retreat several tens of meters away. He then looked at Fang Xinjian, still in a state of shock, and laughed out loud. "My atmospheric armor has never been broken through by anyone before. Therefore, no one knows that it's not the end after it's broken. Instead, there will be an explosion that will attack you directly from the recoil of the air current." At the next moment, he once again put his palms together and activated the atmospheric armor, protecting his entire body. "How is it? Fang Xinjian, are you still going to waste time attacking?" Just then, Fang Xinjian's voice rang out from the smoke. "I can easily slash through things like the atmospheric armor. I can naturally slash through those explosive air currents as well." "So what?" David said confidently. "As long as you slash through my atmospheric armor, you'll be attacked by the shock waves. After you've fended off the shock waves, I'll be able to activate the atmospheric armor again. You won't be able to break through my defense." When the smoke and dust dissipated, Fang Xinjian threw him a sideways glance, turned around, and walked back. He then said to the green-haired Gable, "That's enough. This should be enough to prove that I've attained heaven's perception." Just as David was feeling strange, the entire hall suddenly erupted into loud laughter. A few aristocratic ladies even pointed at David, laughing so hard that they could not stand up straight. David was stunned for a moment before he suddenly reacted. He looked at his body and saw that his pants had been sliced into shreds, revealing his underwear. He then touched his head, which was covered in blood. 4 words had been written on his head by Fang Xinjian's ether sword ripples. It was the words "yellow underwear." David's underwear was yellow. At the instant Fang Xinjian slashed through the atmospheric armor, Fang Xinjian had sent 10 streams of ether sword ripples slashing over, shredding David's clothes and carving words on his head. Moreover, no matter how one listened to the wind, it was impossible for them to discern the color. Only heaven's perception would be able to discern the color of one's underwear with one's eyes closed. Clearly, David would not be willing to reveal the color of his underwear in order to help Fang Xinjian. This put an end to the possibility of cheating by informing him in advance. Almost at the same instant when he sensed the changes on his body, surges of blood rushed to David's head. "Great humiliation, great humiliation." These words kept gushing into David's head, almost causing him to feel so ashamed and furious that he wanted to die. He dashed out of the door, not daring to stay here and let others see his current state. The words on his head, in particular, were a humiliation that he would remember for the rest of his life. When he looked at Fang Xinjian, his mind was filled with killing intent. It was clear that he had already taken Fang Xinjian as his mortal enemy. Chapter 205. Witnessing the scene of Fang Xinjian toying with David, many people laughed. However, regardless of whether they laughed or not, all of them looked at Fang Xinjian with astonishment in their eyes. Heaven's perception, and at the level of a first transition knight, he had used an effulgence weapon to slash through David's atmospheric armor? Countless people were curiously guessing what special effects Fang Xinjian's effulgence weapon had to be able to slash through the atmospheric armor, which was known for its defensive prowess. The green-haired aristocrat, Gable, also looked at everything Fang Xinjian had done with his eyes and mouth agape. When he saw Fang Xinjian walking over, he unconsciously took a few steps back before gulping and saying, "You're amazing." He gave Fang Xinjian a thumbs up and said, "To be able to slash through David's atmospheric armor, I'm impressed." David was a genius aristocrat who was doing extremely well in the great western city. Naturally, a profligate like Gable would find him an eyesore. However, David's abilities were astonishing, and he had a powerful background as well. There were a few times when Gable had gone against David, but he had always been at a disadvantage. Therefore, he knew very well how astonishing the defensive prowess of David's atmospheric armor was. He could not help but recall that the atmospheric armor's defensive prowess was even stronger than that of a level 9 Empire's divine weapon. If Fang Xinjian could slash through the atmospheric armor, then wouldn't he be able to slash through a level 9 Empire's divine weapon like chopping vegetables? Thinking of this, Gable's gaze toward Fang Xinjian seemed to be filled with even more goodwill. The aristocrats who had previously been explaining to their companions how powerful the atmospheric armor was, swearing that it would be impossible for Fang Xinjian to slash through it, felt their faces turning red. They did not dare to look at their companions' doubtful gazes. On the other side, David smiled. Another genius had appeared under his rule, so how could he not be happy? He looked at Fang Xinjian, nodded and said, "Good, good, good. The last time I saw you, I knew that you were extremely talented. Previously, I was still feeling regretful that you had lost your sight. To think that not only did you not waste your life because of your blindness, but you've also continued to work hard and improved further, attaining heaven's perception before everyone else. Since you've attained heaven's perception, it's a given that you'll be able to complete the second transition. His Majesty won't blame me for making an exception and letting you register late. On the contrary, if I continue to insist, I will become stubborn." He thought for a moment and said, "Willin." Fatso and Valen grinned and bowed, listening to Governor Devitt's instructions. "Just tell him that it's my order. Help Fong Xinjian with the registration." "Yes." Valen smiled and nodded. He even winked at Fong Xinjian. Lilia pounced forward and hugged Fong Xinjian from behind. She smiled happily and said, "Teacher, I knew you were the best. You are the best. I knew it." From afar, Cursed City Lord had witnessed everything that had happened in the hall. He let out a sigh. He had not expected that Fong Xinjian would not only be able to overcome the setback of losing his sight, but also make a comeback, attaining heaven's perception and even gaining the recognition of a divine-level expert. Next to Cursed City Lord, a middle-aged man with a slightly bald head said, "Is this how you teach your daughter?" Cursed City Lord laughed. Next to him was Mongol City's City Lord, David's father. Seeing David being humiliated in such a way, of course he felt displeased. This Mongol City Lord was a commoner. After becoming a knight, he had joined the army and fought his way through. After retiring from the army, he had been recommended to enter Mongol's academy to cultivate. He then passed the regional selection and became a conferred knight. After many years, not only had he become the city lord, but he had also built up the entire Mongol city like an iron bucket. What was more impressive was his scheming and ability to curry favor. 20 years ago, he had married the daughter of an aristocrat in the imperial capital. Therefore, he had the backing of a great aristocrat in the imperial capital. However, just as Cursed City Lord was about to explain, he suddenly saw Lilia's innocent smile. He sighed to himself. It had been a long time since he had seen Lilia smile so happily. He sighed inwardly. It's really hard to keep a grown daughter at home. Wife, our Lilia has unknowingly grown up. The corners of his lips curled up slightly as he said, David's skills are inferior. What's there to say? Why, you want to have a spar with me? His attitude made it clear that he was going to support Fong Xinjian. Hearing that, a hint of fury flashed in Mongol City's city lord's eyes. Good, good, good. This is your choice? Then we'll see. With that, he left. He wanted to quickly look for David and discuss with him about sniping Fong Xinjian in the regional selection. If he did not do this, he and his clan would probably become the laughingstock of the great western city's aristocrats for the next few years, or even over 10 years. This was something he would definitely not be able to accept. As the matter came to an end, the banquet resumed once again. However, most of the people's attention was now focused on Fong Xinjian. Many young aristocratic ladies ran over to Fong Xinjian, wanting to get to know this genius better. However, Lilia was like a little beast protecting its food, chasing away all the flirtatious girls until Rhoda brought Hamel and Ralph over. Both Hamel and Ralph looked at Fong Xinjian with an unnatural expression. Fong Xinjian turned his head, looked at Hamel with his eyes closed, and said, "My sword is with you, right?" Hamel nodded, a little embarrassed. Although it was not his idea and Edger had given it to him, he had still used that superior divine weapon for a few months. Thinking of how now that Fong Xinjian had attained heaven's perception, it was almost certain that he would be able to become a conferred knight, Hamel felt increasingly embarrassed. Back then, he had still been able to see the back of this genius, but now, he had left him far behind. Therefore, hearing Fong Xinjian's question, Hamel immediately said, "I'll send it to you tomorrow." Fong Xinjian nodded, looked at Rhoda, and said, "You're not bad. You haven't wasted the past few months." He then threw a glance at Ralph and shook his head. "It's better if you don't participate. Half of the knights in this hall are stronger than you." Hearing this, Ralph's countenance flushed up. However, he did not dare to fight against Fong Xinjian and just left angrily. Just then, a young man dressed in black robes, shrouded in shadows, walked over. It was Anderson, who had transitioned into a shadow death god. Fang Xinjian said to him, "What's the matter?" An ice-cold killing intent engulfed everyone with Anderson's arrival, causing Rhoda and the others' hairs to stand on end. It was as if they were animals that had met their natural enemy. Anderson broke into a cold smile and said, "It's nothing much. I'm just here to take a look at my opponents. Although there are many people participating in the regional selection, there are only a few opponents. Holt, who has a divine-level grandmaster, is one, the unlucky Wei Lung is another, and now there's you." Anderson then smiled, "But you're only a little stronger than Wei Lung. You're just a little weaker than Holt and me." With that, he patted Fang Xinjian's shoulder like an elder and said, "Do your best." Looking at the departing Anderson, Lilia asked, "What's the meaning of his visit?" "Chunibu." Seeing the puzzled gazes from the surrounding people, Fang Xinjian added helplessly, "It's probably because he thinks he's infallible." Everyone understood now. Just then, the governor's wife, the organizer of the 100-Blossom Banquet, Hathaway, stood on the stage in the hall and clapped her hands, attracting everyone's attention. She smiled and said, "Everyone, have you done your best today? Then it's time for the 100-Blossom Banquet to announce the competition for the regional selection." Chapter 206. As Hathaway spoke, all the knights who were preparing to participate in the regional selection stood up agitatedly. In every regional selection, other than the last stage, the arena battle, and the second-to-last stage, the Pantheon Monument observation, the first two stages were designed by the governor himself. It could be said that every region's regional selection was different. This was also to prevent the knights from focusing on the content of the tests and training, neglecting what they should be doing. Hathaway said softly, "The first stage of this regional selection is slashing the heavenly pillar." Slashing the heavenly pillar, as its name suggested, was to attack a huge alloy steel pillar. This alloy steel pillar was a newly developed forging material. Not only was it extremely sturdy, it was also resistant to fire and acid. It even had the ability to recover itself. No matter what kind of attack was launched, as long as it was exposed to sunlight, it would recover within a few seconds. It was a material that was at the level of a divine equipment. In fact, this was the case. It was created from a piece of divine-level bone remains that Governor Devitt had obtained when he was young. Devitt had wanted to forge this piece of bone remains into an unrivaled divine remains equipment, an armor that had the ability to recover itself. Governor Devitt was indeed a master blacksmith. Even Huang Lin had requested for him to forge a divine weapon. He had succeeded in forging an armor with the ability to recover itself, but at the same time, he had also failed. Success meant that he had managed to create this material. However, because its recovery ability was too strong, it was forever fixed in the form of a steel pillar. No matter how it was shaped, whether it was turned into armor, saber, or sword, it would recover within a few seconds. There was no way for it to be used to forge any other equipment. Moreover, he did not have a second divine-level expert's bone remains that could be used to forge the same equipment. This time around, Governor Devitt might as well just use it as the first stage of the regional selection. This stage, slashing the heavenly pillar, would be personally supervised by Governor Devitt. With his cultivation at second transition level 29 and his ether synchronization rate at 100%, he naturally knew the degree of damage done to the alloy steel pillar like the back of his hand. He would be able to give an accurate score to all the students. The top 100 candidates in this stage would advance to the next round. The second stage was known as Fight for the Best. It required the remaining 100 examinees to be placed into a maze that had already been constructed. Each examinee could only stand guard in the location they were placed in and could not be more than 10 meters away from the location. As for the position, it will be chosen according to your ranking in the previous round. The entire labyrinth is filled with ferocious beasts of various levels. They will constantly attack you, and what you need to do is to survive under their attack. Of course, this stage forbade the examinees from directly attacking each other. However, it was still possible to indirectly trip each other up and use schemes to eliminate each other. Only direct attacks were prohibited. Examinees who had given up, lost their battle prowess, or were unable to kill another ferocious beast after 5 minutes had elapsed would be eliminated. They would then be brought out by the invigilators. The last 30 examinees would obtain the right to enter the third stage, the Pantheon Monument Observation. The third stage, Pantheon Monument Observation, was based on how many killing techniques one could comprehend from the Pantheon Monument within 12 hours. In the end, it would be demonstrated in front of the examiners, and the governor and the others would give marks personally. The top 16 would then proceed to the arena battle. The arena tournament would proceed to the final 4 rounds of elimination to determine the top 10. The top 10 would be the ones who had passed the regional selection. The entire process was the regional selection. Towards the end, everyone's eyes were filled with fighting spirit. Everyone was thinking about the contents of the first 2 stages in detail. At the same time, Hathaway smiled and said, "The 100 Blossom Banquet hopes that the Empire's geniuses will be like 100 blooming flowers every year, never ending. This year, due to His Majesty's brilliance, the number of geniuses has far surpassed the previous ones." Shadow Death God Anderson. Constellation's successor, Holt. Wei Lung, a late bloomer with an outstanding will. Of course, there's also the Windstorm Sword hero, Fang Xinjian, whom I've only met today. All of you are the best of the best. If any of you had appeared in the previous regional selections, you would probably have the ability to rule over the other regions. I look forward to your performances. Hathaway did not say a single word, but everyone's gazes turned to the names she had mentioned. The 4 of them instantly attracted the gazes of countless people. Hathaway continued, "Then next up will be the final segment of our 100 Blossom Banquet. Let's invite the representatives of this year's examinees to come up and give a speech." Butler Secker walked up to Fang Xinjian's back and said softly, "Young Master Xinjian, later on, please go up and give a speech as well. Goals, ideals, and the future. You can just casually talk about it." He smiled and said, "It's also to boost everyone's morale." On the other side, Shadow Death God Anderson had already dashed up to the stage. The young man in his teens revealed a pretentious look on his face. Looking at the people below, he said calmly, "Since I'm going to speak, then I'll just say it directly. My dream is to kill a divine-level expert. Therefore, this year's regional champion is mine for sure. Remember this day. In the future, you'll feel proud for listening to my speech today." After saying that, Anderson's cheeks suddenly turned slightly red, and his entire body turned into a black shadow that dissipated into the air, completely disappearing. Lilia shrugged her shoulders, shook her body, and said, "Why is it that when I heard him speak I felt so awkward? This is called Chunibyu," Fang Xinjian thought to himself. Hathaway's lips twitched a little stiffly as she said, "Holt, you can speak next." The elegant Holt took a step forward and leaped into the air, landing on the stage. His actions were as light as a fairy, as if he was an immortal who had descended from the heavens. This immediately caused a series of screams from the aristocratic young ladies. Hearing the screams, Holt waved his hand and said, "Thank you for your welcome. I love you guys too." As he said this, the screams grew even more intense. Hathaway had no choice but to let out a soft bellow before the place regained its silence. Holt continued, "This time around, the reason why I've come to the great western city is mainly because I've received a request from my master. I've come with the intention of learning, to exchange insights and spar with everyone." Holt was clearly very experienced, and what he said next was more conventional. Hathaway nodded, finally revealing a satisfied expression. After Holt walked down, it was Wei Lung's turn to go up with a miserable expression. However, Hathaway had called Wei Ling 3 times before he went up unwillingly. The moment he went up, he said with a cold expression, "I have nothing to say." With that, he went down. Hathaway's countenance was grim as she shook her head. The few seated contestants in this year's competition are each more problematic than the other. Finally, it was Fang Xinjian's turn. Seeing Fang Xinjian go up, Lilia, who was in the distance, cheered. Rhoda, Hamel, and the others also stared at the stage, feeling a common sense of honor. Looking at the people below the stage, Fang Xinjian gave it some thought before saying, "To never surrender, never give in, never compromise, and never retreat. This is what a knight is. I hope that we can all encourage each other with this." Hathaway smiled. Although it was too short, at least it was normal. She took the lead in clapping and then said, "Everyone, there's still 15 days before the regional selection. Please make your preparations and don't be late again." With that, she threw a teasing glance at Fang Xinjian. Chapter 207. After the banquet ended, Yueluan boarded his horse carriage. There was a lady dressed in white waiting for him in the carriage. When she saw Yueluan, she could not help but ask, "Master, what's so special about that Fang Xinjian? Why is it that you seem so unsettled after seeing him?" Yueluan let out a bitter laugh and said, "You can tell as well?" He shook his head. He had not wanted to say it, but after thinking about it, the other party would eventually find out. Therefore, he said, "Fang Xinjian looks a little like that person." "That person?" The lady dressed in white frowned and said, "Who is that person?" Yueluan lifted his head and looked out of the window, his tone filled with the vicissitudes of life. "The person who disappeared 16 years ago." At the start, the lady dressed in white had not reacted. However, at the next moment, a hint of terror flashed on her face. It was as if the person Yueluan was talking about had endless magical powers. The lady dressed in white's teeth clattered as she said, "He looks a lot like that person?" Yueluan shook his head. "It's not just similar. They're exactly the same." "How is that possible? That person shouldn't have any other blood relatives or brothers." The lady dressed in white's pupils dilated, as she said in a trembling voice, "Could it be?" An extremely terrifying and unbelievable possibility came to her mind. She looked at Master Yueluan and asked, "Master, does Grandmaster know about this?" The Grandmaster she was referring to was naturally the Holy Orison. Yueluan shook his head and said, "I don't know. However, the world is going to change soon. If those aristocrats and the other guardian kings in the north were to find out about Fang Xinjian, the empire would probably be in for a lot of trouble." 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, time passed by day. Fang Xinjian stayed in the same hotel as Rhoda and the others. There, he met the other examinees from Kurst who had come to participate in the regional selection, as well as Ferdinand, Anthony, and the others who had come to spectate. Fang Xinjian's name also spread rapidly with the end of the 100-blossom banquet, spreading in all directions. It could be said that he had become famous overnight. In the various betting stalls regarding the regional selection, Fang Xinjian's name, along with the other 3, had become the most popular contenders for the championship. Of course, this also caused many people, including nobles, merchants, and knights, to want to get close to Fang Xinjian and chat with him. However, during this period of time, Fang Xinjian had been staying in his private room in the hotel, not coming out at all. All the people who came to visit him were stopped by Ferdinand, Robert, and Anthony, who were here to watch the competition. Finally, on the morning of the regional selection, Anthony yawned and lay on the sofa, occasionally looking in the direction of the hotel room's door. Opposite him, Robert and Anthony sat there, both of them having trouble calming down. Ferdinand grinned and said, "Still thinking about the gambling stalls?" Anthony looked at Ferdinand unhappily and said, "How can you still be calm? You've bet all 3,000 gold on Xinjian becoming the regional champion, right? No matter how much confidence you have in Xinjian, don't you feel nervous at all?" Robert nodded in agreement. Both he and Anthony had also bet 500 gold on Fang Xinjian, not daring to bet any more. Seeing how relaxed Ferdinand was, they felt extremely puzzled. After the auction of the human skull, they had each received 3,000 gold from Fang Xinjian. Although they had used it to buy some cultivation materials, they had not dared to spend it recklessly. In the end, under Ferdinand's instigation, they had used it to bet on the regional selection. They had been in a constant state of torment, feeling that they had bet too little, and then feeling that they had bet too much. They were even more nervous than the examinees. Hearing their worries, Ferdinand shook his head and said, "Up till now, has Xinjian ever lost before? Regardless of whether it's his aptitude, temperament, or talent, he's the best I've ever seen. I've decided to bet everything on him. What about you guys? What do you think about that matter?" What Ferdinand was saying was that he planned to drop out from Cursed Royal Academy after Fang Xinjian became the regional champion and come to the Great Western City to assist Fang Xinjian. It was because he felt that as compared to cultivating in Cursed Academy, coming to the Great Western City to assist Fang Xinjian and receive his guidance would be much more effective. His future would also be more promising. However, not everyone was as decisive as Ferdinand. When people like Anthony and Robert, who cherished the opportunities they had in Cursed Academy and were infatuated with the various free cultivation resources and subsidies, it was easy for them to hesitate when they heard that they wanted to drop out of the academy. Ferdinand smiled and said, "Then you guys can consider it yourselves. No matter what, it's your choice. Xinjian and I won't blame you." Just then, the door to the room opened and Fang Xinjian walked out. Right now, he no longer looked like the vagabond he had been 15 days ago. After washing up and getting some rest, he once again revealed a delicate and handsome face with a hint of determination. The tight-fitting night attire brought out his well-built physique perfectly, and his 1.9 meters height gave off an oppressive aura. However, the most important thing was that after 15 days of secluded cultivation and cleansing his mind, he had completely returned to his peak condition and his cultivation had improved. During these 15 days, he had focused on cultivating his ether divine art, focusing on the first stage of the regional selection, slashing the heavenly pillar. He had cultivated his high-frequency effulgence weapon, Silver Fox, to level 3, reaching a vibration frequency of 1,500 times per second, once again increasing his slashing ability. Next was to focus on tempering his attribute. Right now, the rebirth sword technique, which would automatically circulate in his body every day, had given him 20,000 potential points, double what he had in the past. After 15 days, he had gained a total of 300,000 potential points. He allocated all of these potential points equally to his strength and reaction. Therefore, Fang Xinjian's attributes were now: name, Fang Xinjian age, 17 occupation, Wind Shadow Sword divinity level, 19 strength, 70 plus 5 agility, 193 plus 5 reaction, 81 endurance, 51 flexibility, 53 ether synchronization rate, 10%. The attributes above come into effect once the Sonido Sword Zephyr Waves is activated. Due to perfect muscles, plus 5 in strength and agility, 10% of the endurance and agility attribute. Techniques: Rebirth Sword Technique, New 9-Headed Dragon Sword Technique, Luminous Heaven Soaring Slash, Level 3 Ether Divine Art Specialties. Genius Swordsmanship, Elementary Survival Instinct, Internal Healing, Internal Training, Sword Specialist, Heightened Reflexes, Perfect Muscles, Elementary Berserkness, Apex Unparalleled Sword Intent Waves Level 7 Sonido Sword Zephyr Waves Mental Cultivation Method Level 5 Universal Sword Dominance Lunisolar. The moment he came out, it was as if the mental energy, chi activity, or information had been stimulated. The doors to the other rooms opened one after another, and Manny, Rhoda, Hamill, Ralph, and the other students from Cursed Academy all walked out. Their eyes shone brightly, and it was clear that they had spent the last 15 days adjusting themselves to their peak state. Fang Xinjian looked at Ferdinand and the others, casually took the longsword from them, and said with a smile, "Let's go." As for the longsword he had taken, it was naturally the level 20 superior remains divine weapon that Hamel had taken the initiative to return. Sticks. Chapter 208. It was a level 20 superior divine weapon, Styx. Putting aside its material, ordinary Empire's divine weapons and inferior divine weapons would never be able to slash through it. Even Fang Shijian himself was helpless against this stick. At the very least, he would not be able to slash through it using ordinary means. As for whether it would be of any use if he slashed out a few hundred ether sword ripples, he was no fool and had never tried it before. Other than being extremely sturdy and sharp, the Styx's special effect was that Governor Devitt had carved 999 wind prints on it. This was also Fang Xinjian's request. This Styx was 3 meters long and 3 fingers wide. There were densely packed prints on it, looking like the claw marks left behind by countless ghosts. With a light swing, it would emit a sound that sounded like 10,000 ghosts wailing. Of course, the design of the wind prints was not for sound attacks like the demoness howl, but to enhance sword cheese. If Fang Xinjian were to use this Styx to perform the luminous heaven soaring slash, he would be able to control the atmosphere to shoot out sword cheese, condensing them to a distance of 180 meters before dissipating. The attack and destructive prowess would also be greatly enhanced, and with just a casual swing, he would be able to send out sword cheese at supersonic speed. Therefore, Fang Xinjian now had 2 long swords hanging on his waist. One was the demoness howl, while the other was the Styx. On his thigh was the silver dragon. Lilia stood at the entrance of the inn. When she saw Fang Xinjian coming out, she immediately went up to him. "Teacher, you'll definitely be the regional champion this time around." She clenched her small fists and said excitedly, "We'll be cheering you on from the spectator stands." Therefore, the group headed to the venue of the regional selection. The Great Western Region's Regional Royal Academy was the holy land in the hearts of countless knights in the Great Western Region. When they arrived at the Academy's entrance, the surroundings were already crowded with people. All sorts of examinees, family members, teachers, and students were either here to participate in the competition or to watch. When Fang Xinjian saw this scene, he felt as if he was looking at the college entrance examinations back on Earth. No, it should be said that it was even more important than that. However, although there was a huge crowd, when Fang Xinjian arrived and was recognized, the surrounding crowd still subconsciously made way for him. Countless people turned their gazes in his direction. There were people who wanted to come over and greet Fang Xinjian, but they were all politely rejected by Ferdinand and the others. What a joke! Right now, the most important thing for Fang Xinjian was the upcoming regional selection. How could he possibly allow them to disturb him? A group of people slowly parted the crowd and walked towards the academy's gate. However, he soon encountered David, who had a gloomy expression on his face. At that moment, David was hugging a white cloth on his head, as if he was covering his face, afraid that others would recognize him. Behind him were a total of 2 knights with unfathomable auras, who seemed to be very extraordinary. Seeing that he had bumped into Fang Xinjian, David glared at him and said, "Fang Xinjian, I'll make this regional selection unforgettable for you for the rest of your life. What happened yesterday will be the one thing you'll regret the most in your life." His words were filled with hatred, jealousy, and killing intent, all of them were unprecedented. It was because he had never been so humiliated in his entire life. Right now, all the aristocrats in the great western city were treating what had happened yesterday as a joke. If he did not kill Fang Xinjian, he would never be able to raise his head again. Therefore, with the help of his father, he had made all the necessary preparations. He was determined to assassinate Fang Xinjian in this regional selection. Even if he did not kill him, He would have to eliminate him so that he would not be able to participate in the upcoming regional selection. However, Fang Xinjian did not pay him any heed. Ferdinand stood before David and laughed out loud. "Lad, who are you? You came here just because you're talking to yourself?" David threw a cold glance at Ferdinand and did not pay him any heed. After finishing his words, he turned and left. It was obvious that he was not willing to continue arguing with Ferdinand. In the last 15 days of the regional selection, he had made too many preparations and paid too much of a price. His goal was to kill Fang Xinjian. Fang Xinjian. This time around, no one will be able to protect you. However, someone at the side introduced David's identity to Ferdinand. Hearing that, Ferdinand let out a cold laugh and looked at David with ill intentions. After the examinees waited at the entrance for about 20 minutes, the regional academy's door finally opened slowly. All the examinees brought their knight emblems and knight attire up to register and then entered the academy to take part in the examination. The entire examination would last for 4 days, with one stage each day. For the next 4 days, not only would they have to take the examination in the regional academy, but they would also have to live in the academy. Lilia stood outside, looked at the long queue and said, "There are so many people. There are so many people participating in this regional selection." "Of course," Ferdinand said. "The rewards for this year's regional selection are too shocking and have attracted many people. There seems to be over 500 knights participating. That's almost a third of the students from all 12 academies in the Great Western region." He then smiled. "Let's go. Let's watch the competition through the spectators' passageway." In order to encourage martial arts, as well as to maintain the principle of openness and fairness, the entire process of the regional selection was open to spectators. Of course, there was a fee for this as well. The fee was 5 gold per spectator, which put an end to the possibility of commoners watching. Basically, only the aristocrats were allowed to watch. Fang Xinjian took his examination number plate and followed the signs to a huge training ground. What he needed to do next was to wait for the examinees to arrive. He looked at the spectators' stands and saw Ferdinand, Lilia, Anthony, and the others waving at him. Finally, after all 512 examinees had arrived, the main examiner, Governor Devitt, walked in. Behind him was an old man who seemed to have his eyes closed, Commissioner of Education Luke. There was also an intelligent and capable-looking Commissioner of Education Yaris, who was about 40 years old. There was also a middle-aged Deputy Governor, Armstrong, whose face was covered in scars. With Governor Devitt as the main examiner, these were the 4 examiners for this year's regional selection. Although they held high positions and held great authority, they still had to personally supervise and mark the examinees during the regional selection. This showed how much importance and strictness the Empire placed on the regional selection. To them, each regional selection was a very important achievement. On the other side, under the movement of 12 knights, a huge steel pillar from the pagoda was slowly moved onto the training ground. With a loud bang, the steel pillar was thrown onto the ground, and the entire ground seemed to tremble a little. However, after the steel pillar smashed onto the ground, it did not bounce up at all. It sank 3 inches deep into the ground, showing how heavy it was and how densely packed it was. Seeing this scene, the countenances of many of the knights instantly changed. In the next moment, Governor Devitt said slowly, "Then this year's regional selection officially begins. I won't say much. Now, it's the first stage, slashing the heavenly pillar. Number 1, come up." Chapter 209. Examinee number 1 was a middle-aged man with sparse hair. He came from the north of the Great Western region and was 45 years old this year. He had participated in 7 consecutive regional selections but had not passed them all. This was his final battle. If he still did not pass, then he would stay in the north to be an instructor and nurture the next generation of knights. On the spectator stands, when they saw examinee number 1 walking up, a pair of young men and women immediately shouted, "Daddy, you can do it!" Examinee number 1 smiled, waved at them, and finally walked up to the metal pillar. The entire metal pillar was about 2 meters tall and 1 meter wide. Its surface was so black that it did not reflect any light at all, giving off a feeling that it was as deep as hell. Under the gaze of the 4 examiners, examinee number 1 became slightly nervous. With 4 important characters as the main examiners, with their cultivation and fame, the results would be even fairer and more valuable. However, at the same time, it would also bring pressure to the examinees. However, examinee number 1 had taken this test many times, so he soon stabilized his breathing. He then drew out the big sword on his back, and streams of long flames appeared on his long sword. 100 degrees, 200 degrees, 300 degrees, all the way to a high temperature of over 1,000 degrees. The middle-aged man let out an explosive bellow and instantly accelerated, bringing along a long stream of white gas. He became one with the sword, and a high-temperature slash at supersonic speed slashed fiercely onto the metal pillar. Violent air currents blew out in all directions, and the high-temperature flame currents were like fireworks. Such a terrifying destructive prowess was like the firing of a cannon. However, when the smoke dissipated and the metal pillar was revealed, there was only a dent about 1 inch deep on it. A few seconds later, the dent gradually disappeared, as if it had never been attacked. Examinee number 1 retreated with his hands covered in blood, looking at this scene in disbelief. Governor Devitt said calmly, 7 points. The other 3 said, 7 points. 7 points. 7 points. Although the 4 of them had given their own scores, with their heaven's perception and the ability to receive information from ether particles within a 10-meter radius, they were able to grasp the degree of damage done to the metal pillar from the finest details. Therefore, they all gave the same score. Putting aside the fact that examinee number 1 retreated in disappointment, the other examinees' countenances became even more grim as they looked at the metal pillar. This thing is too hard. The destructive prowess of examinee number 1's earlier attack was already much stronger than mine. Even he could only produce such an effect? Of course. That was created by Governor Devitt. On the spectator stand, Ferdinand shook his head. What on earth is this thing? Isn't it too powerful? Is there anyone in this batch who can completely destroy it? Cursed City Lord suddenly appeared. Ignoring the astonished gazes of the people around him, he introduced, "This thing was created by Governor Devitt using the remains of a divine-level expert. Although the creation was a failure and he wasn't able to turn it into a divine remains equipment, in terms of toughness, it's already very close to that of a divine equipment. It's at least the toughness of a level 29 superior divine weapon. Number 1, if it wasn't the fact that it's self-regeneration, it old one would be able. D-God 2 Ferdinand King 2, Demon Lilia was also worried. She didn't have the time to be angry with her father. She asked directly, what are the chances of Teacher Guan winning? It shouldn't be a problem for him to be in the top 10, but he probably won't be the one with the best results. Cursed City Lord shook his head and said, although this thing has a very high toughness, it doesn't have the special effects of a divine weapon. Therefore, there are flaws in its defense. Although Fang Xinjian's destructive prowess is very strong, based on what I know, there are at least 2 people in this batch who are even stronger than him. Ferdinand played along and asked, who? Cursed City Lord replied, naturally, it's the Shadow Death God Anderson and that narcissistic Holt. Seeing the puzzled gazes of the people around him, Cursed City Lord explained, Anderson's job, the Shadow Death God, has always been regarded as the job with the strongest instantaneous explosive prowess and ability to move stealthily among all the first transition jobs. Stealthily is because he can transform into shadows to move. As for instantaneous explosive prowess, It's because the Shadow Death God can perform a type of shadow corrosion attack, which can instantly reduce the toughness of the target's materials. No matter what kind of divine weapon or armor it is, it would be like paper before him. As for Holt, I know that his master has given him a level 29 superior divine weapon, Crimson Fire. A level 29 superior divine weapon would naturally be able to break through this steel pillar. Lilia said angrily, "Then isn't this very unfair?" "Fair. Job techniques and equipment are all a part of a knight's abilities," Cursed City Lord said. "And if one is unable to even get into the top 100 in this stage, then one will naturally not be qualified to become a conferred knight. Moreover, the ranking in this stage will not affect the top 10 in the regional selection in the future." What happened next was just as Cursed City Lord had said. No knight was able to leave a mark of more than 3 inches on the steel pillar. The knight with the highest score was only a prefectural champion who was about 30 years old, who ended up with 9.5 points. Then, under everyone's anticipation, it was finally Shadow Death God Anderson's turn. He walked up with a disdainful expression, saying mockingly, "A bunch of trash. I'll let you guys see what a real attack is." With that, he took a step forward, bringing along a series of afterimages as he dashed up to the steel pillar. He then pressed one of his palms onto the steel pillar. The job technique, Shadow Coffin, was activated. In an instant, a black shadow encompassed the entire steel pillar. In the next moment, Anderson took out a dagger. This was the level 19 inferior divine weapon, Shadow Tooth, which his academy had specially prepared for him. Killing technique, Sun Piercer. Like a meteor cutting across the sky, or like sunlight piercing through the clouds, Anderson gathered all of his powers onto the Shadow Tooth, and then a spiraling force pierced out fiercely. The Shadow Coffin could weaken the toughness of the target's material. The divine weapon Shadow Tooth could turn all the augmented powers into a spiraling force, and the Sun Piercer could instantly turn all the powers into a single point and burst out explosively. With 3 consecutive bursts, Anderson's destructive prowess was raised to an astonishing level. Amidst crisp kacha-kacha sounds, his entire arm, including his elbow, sank into the steel pillar. A huge hole appeared on the steel pillar, almost penetrating through half of its thickness. The wound looked as if it had been drilled by a drill. Retracting his arm, Anderson looked at the steel pillar, which was beginning to wriggle and recover. His lips twitched as he said, "TSK, it didn't go through?" With that, he left without even turning back, as if he was not worried about his results at all. Other than giving marks, the examiners also gave their comments, which was rare for them. Governor Devitt said, 1 point of strength piercer, extremely adept at the job technique. Even a level 20 conferred knight would not dare to receive this attack easily. 48 points. The old commissioner of education, Luke, who looked as if he would enter his coffin at any moment, was the person whom Edger had mentioned back then. He had always supported the academy to be responsible for its own profits and losses, and to pull in its own investments. He opened his mouth and said weakly, "A sure kill attack. In the future, when you go through the second transition, there'll definitely be a place for you in the imperial capital." 48 points. The shrewd and capable Yari smiled and said, "Not bad. When I was your age, I probably wouldn't even be able to receive a single attack from you. The finishing move is still a little lacking. I'll give 47 points." The Deputy Governor Armstrong, who was covered in scars, said coldly, "Fast, accurate, and ruthless. It's a move meant purely for killing, but it's a little disadvantageous to use it on slashing the heavenly pillar. I'll give you 49 points." In the end, under everyone's dumbfounded gazes, Anderson obtained 48 points. Chapter 210. It's too shocking. Such destructive prowess. Is this the power of the Shadow Death God? There's no way a knight can fend it off. It's not just knights. Even a conferred knight would not be able to fend it off if he doesn't unleash his abilities. Everyone looked at Anderson with fear, astonishment, and disbelief. Anderson smiled, revealing a proud expression, as if he was a primary school student who had scored 100 marks in an exam. When he saw Holt's gaze turn toward him, he gave him the middle finger in disdain. This lad. Holt tightened his grip on Crimson Fire and frowned. As for the other seated player, Wei Lung, it was as if he was living in a completely different world. No matter what happened in the outside world, he would not react at all. Other than Anderson, there was no one else who could display such a powerful destructive prowess. Even when Wei Lung appeared, although he had gained powerful observation and reaction abilities after attaining Heaven's perception, causing his battle prowess to increase tremendously, he did not have any powerful killing techniques, and his instantaneous explosive prowess could not be compared to someone like Anderson. Devitt shook his head and said, "Wei Lung, you've really disappointed me. Have you been cultivating seriously after attaining Heaven's perception? You're still using the same skills as before. Although your destructive prowess is already higher than that of ordinary people, you shouldn't only be at this level." 12 points. Education Commissioner Luke, who had countless wrinkles on his skin and was the oldest among the four, said, "This performance is a waste of your talent." 12 points. Yari said calmly, "Disappointing, 12 points. Armstrong did not give any comments either, saying directly, "Ordinary, 12 points. In the end, Wei Lung only got 12 points. Sigh, to think that even after awakening Heaven's perception, Wei Lung is still unable to get close to Anderson? Although it's Heaven's perception, before reaching level 20, the synchronization rate is at most 10%. It's impossible for him to identify the weakness in the steel pillar. It's a pity. Although his talent is strong, his destructive prowess has nothing to do with his talent. Looks like Fang Shijian won't be able to get high marks either. The Windstorm Sword Hero has unparalleled speed and excels in guerrilla warfare, but his destructive prowess and explosive prowess are lacking. That's right. Looks like the first and second place will be between Anderson and Holt." Hearing the comments from the surroundings, Lilia clenched her fists tightly, her face filled with anger. Cursed City Lord patted her on the shoulder and said, "It's all right, Lily. The first stage is not what Fang Xinjian is good at. It'll be fine in the second stage. That kind of one versus many battle is what a Windstorm Sword Hero is best at." Just as they were talking, Holt stepped onto the stage. Today, he wore an emerald gown and held a crimson sword in his hand. His long hair casually draped over his shoulders, making him look like a fallen noble. As soon as he stepped onto the stage, a group of noble girls shrieked incessantly. Holt ran his fingers through his hair, bowed to the four examiners, and began to draw his sword. There seemed to be streams of red light flashing within the crimson-red sword scabbard. When this longsword was completely unsheathed, Fang Shijian's brows also twitched slightly. Ferdinand, Lilia, Rhoda, and Hamel, who were in the arena, were all astonished. It was a longsword that did not have a physical body and was purely burning like flames. A term immediately appeared in Fang Xinjian's mind: lightsaber? The level 29 superior divine weapon in Holt's hand was a treasured sword that looked like a lightsaber. Seemingly satisfied with everyone's astonished gazes, Holt smiled and let out a soft bellow. As he exerted force with his hands, a violent heat wave gushed forth. Everyone in the arena felt the temperature rise crazily, as if they had suddenly arrived in a desert. Rhoda's pupils contracted as she stared at the crimson fire longsword. She saw that the flames that formed the longsword continued to rise in temperature, and after about a minute, they turned into a viscous substance similar to liquid water. It was as if a fire snake had come to life, swaying incessantly, emitting an astonishing high temperature. The crimson fire longsword, which had a temperature of several thousand degrees, was held in Holt's hand. Then, Holt slashed out, activating the killing technique Fire Dragon Slash. The Crimson Fire longsword turned into a fire snake and pounced out. Wherever it passed by, the air distorted and explosions rang out. The fire snake had completely wrapped up the alloy pillar, as if the fire snake had swallowed the steel pillar into its stomach. Boom, boom, boom sounds rang out incessantly, followed by a series of explosions. The high temperature kept on occurring in the fire snake's stomach, and the entire steel pillar was melting and breaking at a speed that could be seen by the naked eye. When Holt retracted the crimson fire, the ground under the steel pillar had already turned into a state like lava. 1/3 of the steel pillar had completely melted, and it was slowly recovering. However, the speed was over 100 times slower than before. Looking at the scene, everyone gasped. This destructive prowess was even more terrifying than that of the Shadow Death god Anderson. It was hard to imagine what kind of person would be able to survive in the Crimson Fire's stomach. If Holt had enough time to launch a few more attacks, he would probably be able to melt the steel pillar completely. However, after unleashing this attack, the Crimson Fire had already returned to its original state of being an ordinary flame. It was clear that this attack could only be used once after accumulating power. With such a requirement to accumulate power, the effects of this attack would be greatly reduced. However, it was very reasonable to use it in the stage of Slash the Heavenly Pillar. It was because this was a competition of destructive prowess. Although Holt's Fire Dragon Slash required accumulating power, its destructive prowess was astonishing. Seeing this scene, Governor Devitt sighed and said, "Crimson Fire Sword. It's been a long time since I've seen it." Holt smiled and said, "Teacher said that he misses you very much too." "Haha, that old man wouldn't miss me. I'm the one who snatched his girlfriend to be his wife." Hathaway, who was on the stage, frowned coldly and cursed inwardly. "This old man." Devitt continued, "Although this attack of yours is ingenious in accumulating power, it relies too much on the weapon's advantage. I can only give you 55 points. Sir, thank you for your guidance." The white-haired Commissioner of Education, Luke, grinned. His lips trembled as he spoke in an old voice, as expected of the astral ancestor's disciple. "With the Crimson Fire and your cultivation, you should be the regional champion this year. I'll give you 60 points. Hearing this, Devitt frowned. This Luke was completely shameless in order to bootlick a divine-level expert. Yaris, who was the youngest amongst them, said, "It's really amazing. The high temperature at the end should be able to melt a superior divine weapon. Just from this alone, your future achievements will probably not be lower than your teachers. I'll give you 58 points. Armstrong, who was the last to speak, spoke. As he spoke, the scar on his face twisted like a centipede. The move is magnificent and the attack is powerful. However, the action of accumulating power is too much of a burden. It's not practical in battle. I'll give you 54 points. Just like that, Holt, who had unleashed this attack, received 56. 75 points, 75 points higher than Anderson. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.